Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Russia says it has detained the person responsible for killing one of their top generals, Igor Kirillov. Aides of President-elect Donald Trump will travel to Kyiv in early January as the administration looks to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And judges in France prepared to deliver their verdict in the Pelicot rape trial, the highest profile case the country has ever seen. To our top story, and Russia says it has detained a suspect over the murder of one of the country's top generals. Igor Kirillov and his assistant were killed in Moscow yesterday after a bomb planted on a scooter exploded. The suspect, an Uzbekistan citizen, has confessed to planting and detonating the bomb as instructed by Ukraine's security service. Let's go live to Kyiv now to speak to our correspondent, Alex Kadje. Alex, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. What more do we know about the suspect, and what has he told Russian authorities?
What we know is that this 29-year-old Uzbek man was arrested by Russian authorities and almost immediately confessed that he was behind the assassination of Lieutenant General Kirillov, an Uzbek national who allegedly told Russian security services that he was paid $100,000 and given a European passport as payment for the hit. What we don't know is under what conditions this confession was made. We don't exactly know the background of the investigation and why and how the Russian authorities managed to apprehend this person so quickly. Certainly from the Ukrainian side, there is no comment on this arrest or on this particular individual at this stage, but those Russian security sources leaking a video to a Russian news outlet where we could see this man's confession saying that he was behind the murder of Lieutenant General Kirillov. But as I said, we don't know exactly how that confession came about.
Alex, Putin has vowed to punish those involved in the killing. What kind of retaliation is likely, and what does this mean for the ongoing fighting?
Well, when it comes to the ongoing fighting, it's unclear whether or not these high-profile assassinations from Ukraine have an impact on the battleground in the short term. But what they do have the impact is to make sure that Russian officials are looking over their shoulders. That is the perspective from the Ukrainian side. They want anybody prosecuting Russia's invasion in Ukraine to be worried of retaliation, and retaliation could strike at any moment. That is the feeling they are hoping to have on those top Russian military officials and those involved. It's the third high-profile assassination in the last month, so certainly that is one impact on the battlefield. Less clear what the impact will be. Now, when it comes to that retaliation, we don't know. Security around top Ukrainian officials has been tight since the start of the full-scale invasion. We remember that President Zelensky was the target at the very start of Russia's invasion. Russian forces were here in Kyiv, tasked with killing the president. Obviously, they did not succeed, but certainly that security has been tight. It may be a retribution against top officials, or it might be targeting the country more broadly, hitting energy infrastructure, trying to freeze the Ukrainian population, like we've seen Russia do in the last couple of weeks.
Zelensky is in Brussels today. He's attending these high-profile meetings organised by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. What is he hoping to achieve?
Well, he wants to bolster European support. That will be his key priority. We saw a message from the Ukrainian president posted on Telegram from Brussels talking about his meetings with European allies. He says that Europe needs a strong position for the sake of a reliable peace, and every fundamental issue that concerns Europe and the end of Russia's war against Ukraine, particularly with an incoming Trump presidency, which could mean less support for Ukraine. Well, then the Europeans may need to step up. The other topic, of course, is whether or not European troops could contribute to some kind of buffer zone if a ceasefire were to be agreed. Now, that's still a long way away, but even if it were to happen, those European countries have to prepare their troops pretty soon. So those discussions ongoing. An interesting little parallel discussion. Robert Fico, the Slovak Prime Minister, will ask his Ukrainian counterparts. He's not been a big fan of Ukraine, nor has he been in favour of supporting Ukraine in this war. He will ask his Ukrainian counterparts to continue a deal whereas Russian gas could flow through Ukraine and be sold in Europe. That deal expires at the end of the month. Ukraine not keen to renew it, but the Slovaks want cheaper gas and therefore asking a favour of their Ukrainian counterparts.
Alex Cadier in Kyiv, thank you very much for your insights. Meanwhile, US President-elect Donald Trump is sending his envoy nominee for Ukraine to the war-torn nation next month as he bids to bring an end to the fighting on day one of his term. Retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg will travel to Kyiv and several other European capitals before Trump even takes office. Tracking the story for us is our correspondent, Benji Haya.
This is Keith Kellogg, Chief of Staff for the White House National Security Council during former President Trump's first term. And he's the man tasked by the incoming president to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, almost 3 years on from Russia's invasion.
Everyone's being killed. It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II. I've had pictures of fields where bodies are lying on top of bodies. Looks like the old pictures of the Civil War, where just bodies are all over. Just if you saw those pictures, you'd feel more strongly about it. It's got to stop.
Donald Trump is vowing to end the war in a single day, though he's not said how.
What should Zelensky, if anything, be prepared to give up to end this war?
He should be prepared to make a deal. That's all. Got to be a deal. No, got to be a deal. Too many people being killed. That is a war that's too many people. Got to make a deal.
A deal, or a settlement based on territory, would mean Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian leader Vladimir Putin both coming to the negotiating table. It's why outgoing President Joe Biden is pushing through extra weapons for Ukraine to help its forces keep hold of some of Russia's territory that it's gained, giving the Ukrainian government the best hand possible in potential talks.
The President approved a new security assistance package for Ukraine that will provide them with additional air defense, artillery, drones, and armored vehicles. It's the 72nd such drawdown package announced by the United States, and as the President made clear, we're going to continue to provide additional packages right up to the end of this administration.
Yet from January 20th, the Trump administration may decide to reduce, pause, or even reverse that military aid, or make it conditional on Ukraine participating in talks. The Western Defence Alliance, NATO, has now taken over from the US in coordinating military assistance to Ukraine, a move aimed at protecting funding from any change in posture in Washington. Keith Kellogg's proposal would see NATO membership for Ukraine taken off the cards in the near term, a stark contrast to the country's own so-called victory plan. Both he and Donald Trump claim they'll secure peace through strength while upholding America's interests, but at what cost to Ukraine and the world. Benji Haya, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
To Paris, and judges in France are expected to deliver their verdict on Thursday in one of the most high-profile trials the country has ever seen. 51 men are accused of raping 72-year-old Giselle Pelicot dozens of times while she laid unconscious. She was repeatedly drugged at the hands of her now former husband in abuse that lasted for 9 years. Her ex-husband has admitted to recruiting men online and filming the abuse, but many of the defendants deny deny rape. Prosecutors have demanded a range of sentences, including up to 20 years in jail for Dominique Pelicot. Riz Khan has this report.
This has been a case that has stunned France. The trial of Gisèle Pelicot's ex-husband and 50 other men. The harrowing case has shone a spotlight on drug-induced assault and sparked calls for more work on prevention and possible changes to the law surrounding consent.
I'm more than determined to ensure that chemical submission in France for the purpose of sexual crimes is truly recognized as a public health and public utility matter.
Maëlle Noir is a researcher in feminist movements and gender politics.
It was really important to us and to French society that Gisèle decided to speak up and to be seen as a victim, but we are being very cautious about not, elevating her as an icon of, bravery and courage to make sure that other victims who also decide to, go through another route to find justice are also recognized as such.
The defendants in the Pelicot case come from all walks of life. They are aged between 25 and 72, accused of rape, aggravated rape, attempted rape and sexual assault. Some pleaded guilty, while others deny rape, saying they thought Gisèle Pelicot was pretending to be asleep or that her husband's approval was sufficient for the acts not to be assault.
Campaigners blame a lack of confidence in the justice system, a culture of blaming victims in law enforcement and wider discrimination in society as reasons for women under-reporting rape.
Throughout the trial, there have been weekly demonstrations. Calls are growing louder for France to change the legal definition of rape. It currently includes notions of violence, coercion, threat or surprise, but many argue the law must also incorporate consent. The court case could have been behind closed doors, but Gisèle Pelicot waived her anonymity and in doing so became a figurehead, and there is hope that through her bravery and the consequences of the trial, deeper changes in French society can take place. Riz Khan, Arabiya News, Paris.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. A plot to assassinate Pope Francis during a trip to Iraq was stopped following a tip-off from British intelligence. In his upcoming autobiography, the Pope said after landing in Baghdad in March 2021, he was told 2 suicide bombers were preparing to target an event he was set to attend. Both attackers were subsequently intercepted and killed. Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan must pay £2.8 million after losing a court case over unpaid tax claims brought by England's Devon and Cornwall police. A judge ruled they failed to pay any tax on £21 million of revenue from online businesses, including OnlyFans. In a statement, the controversial social media influencer said this was not justice, rather a coordinated attack on anyone who dares to challenge the system. Relief operations are ramping up in Mayotte following the aftermath of deadly Cyclone Chido, as 120 tons of food arrived on the island today. Health workers are also preparing for a potential surge of disease as recovery efforts continue after the worst storm to hit the overseas French territory in 90 years. The death toll does remain unclear, with only 22 fatalities confirmed in hospitals so far. Luigi Mangione, the man accused of killing an insurance company's chief executive in New York, has been charged with murder as an act of terrorism. Mangione is suspected of shooting Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare boss, on the 4th of December and was arrested following a 5-day manhunt. Prosecutors are trying to bring him to a New York court from a Pennsylvania jail. And more than 150 volunteers have rescued an explorer from the same Italian cave for the second time in 17 months. Octavia Pinna was airlifted to hospital after she fell around 6 meters in an underground cave system, sustaining injuries to her vertebrae, ribs, face and also knee. She was taking part in a project to map the uncharted underground tunnels in the Bergamo area of northern Italy. Now to the Middle East. And a potential ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas still hangs in the balance as the two sides consider negotiations. Hamas have said a deal is possible, whilst the Israeli defense minister has stated his country will control security in Gaza with full freedom to act, even after the war ends. However, Israel is continuing attacks across Gaza, with at least 38 people killed in the last 24 hours, according to the territory's health ministry. The Kamal Adwan hospital was targeted, which resulted in the intensive care unit being put out of service. According to the Gaza health ministry, over 45,000 Palestinians have been killed and over 107,000 injured in Israel's military offensive on Gaza since October the 7th last year. We can now cross over to Tel Aviv, where our correspondent Trent Murray is standing by. Good evening, Trent, and thank you so much for joining us. So we spoke yesterday regarding a potential ceasefire deal being close. So we've been here before. Why could it be different this time?
Well, Leigh Ann, we are really tracking two sets of talks which we know are taking place right now. The first is in Cairo, the Egyptian capital, where we understand the Hamas leadership within Gaza itself is involved in some of those discussions. Talks also taking place in Qatar, where the more international leadership of the Hamas group has been based and has held talks in the past. Right now, there feels a degree of cautious optimism, I guess you could say, both here in Israel, within the region, and also within the United States, based on what we are hearing. We know the US has said that they've been told that the two sides are getting closer. An Israeli official speaking to the Times of Israel today has said that from their perspective, Hamas is showing some more flexibility when it comes to trying to iron out those final details. We know Bill Burns as well, who is the director of the US CIA, arrived in Qatar earlier today to join those sets of talks. Again, cautious optimism. We have been here before and it has all collapsed right at the end of the finish line. But I think for many in this region, they're hoping that maybe this time it could be different. 439 days now of this war.
Let's just pick up on something you're talking about there. Hamas has said a ceasefire deal is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. What kind of conditions does Israel want? Are those goalposts changing, essentially?
Well, look, we know consistently that the Israeli position has been any sort of ceasefire agreement would be exactly that. It would be a ceasefire, not a permanent withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. As we heard there, Israel Katz, the defense minister, has said even after this conflict comes to an end, Israel still wants to maintain security. That, for a long time, appears to have been a red line for Hamas. They are pushing heavily for Israel to withdraw completely, but we understand now that things are starting to change a little bit, and I think there is potentially the Trump factor creeping in based on certainly some of the briefings that we're hearing here. I think both sides are acutely aware that a highly unorthodox and unpredictable US president is coming soon, and that he may not slam the brakes on Israel as much as President Biden has done on the past. So potentially that is a factor that is certainly making minds concentrate at that negotiating table. We also know some questions around hostages that may be exchanged. We know Hamas would like to get a number of Palestinian prisoners back as part of any hostage deal for the Israelis to get their people home, but there seems to be disagreement over just who those Palestinians may be and how many.
The UN's humanitarian agency believes Israel is denying aid missions to North Gaza, with 3 aid convoys told to turn back on Tuesday. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, Israeli officials, again speaking here to Israeli media, have actually acknowledged that they have reduced the amount of private aid trucks going in, trucks that are run by businessmen and other groups who have been trying to get food and necessities to Gaza. They say that the reason they are doing that is because those trucks are likely to be looted because they don't have as much security. But of course, what aid groups are saying on the ground is that the situation does just remain desperately bleak. There is not enough food, water, medicine getting in. The WHO has warned that a medical team trying to get to Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza was denied access by the IDF. So again, while those negotiations are taking place, you know, for the people of Gaza, it is still just an incredibly desperate situation as those aid groups and foreign governments continue to really sound the alarm. I should also just mention, you know, we of course are in the Middle East. Temperatures don't get too low, but the temperature is now dropping here as winter arrives. So one would hope that if we can get a ceasefire, it can bring some much needed respite to the people of Gaza.
Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining us. After 2 weeks of relative respite, India's capital New Delhi is breathing toxic smog once again. Air quality levels have dipped to their lowest levels this month, prompting officials to enact strict anti-pollution measures again, which include closing schools and asking employees to work from home. Ishan Garg tells us more from New Delhi.
Air that looks opaque and smells like smoke. This toxic air is what 30 million Delhi residents are breathing. Doctors warn prolonged exposure to this level of pollution is dangerous, even for healthy individuals.
My eyes burn and I find it difficult to breathe. Most mornings when I cough, it's painful, and often I find black spots in my phlegm.
PM 2.5 pollutants are more than 50 times permissible limits. These fine particles, which are invisible to the naked eye, can get lodged in lungs. Experts say this increases the risk of strokes and heart attack. As temperature dips in the winter months, experts say pollutants don't disperse easily, making air pollution a perennial concern. And it's not just New Delhi that is choking. According to a new study published in the medical journal The Lancet, air pollution is causing about 1.5 million deaths across the country every year. Authorities have now banned polluting vehicles in Delhi and in adjoining cities. Schools have been asked to hold classes online for younger students, and several private offices have asked employees to work from home until the situation improves. But many residents are increasingly growing impatient with these short-term solutions.
Pollution has become a disease with no medicine, and the problem isn't just limited to one area or a specific time frame. The situation is bad this year, but it was just as bad last year, and it will continue to be bad next year and the year after that.
Vehicular emission along with industrial pollution are big contributors to Delhi's toxic air. Crop burning by farmers across North India to clear fields at this time of the year also plays a role. Environmentalists say a year-round program focusing on transitioning to green energy and mobility and stemming industrial emission is urgently needed. Without it, Delhi's future could be just as bleak as its skies. Ishan Garg, Al Arabiya News, New Delhi.
Let's take a look at the top business news. It's reported that the Japanese car makers Honda and Nissan could be set for a potential merger in order to compete with electric vehicle makers. Earlier in the year, the two companies announced they were exploring new possibilities for a future collaboration. Now, Amazon workers in the US could go on strike the week before Christmas after Teamsters union members voted to support industrial action. It's thought facilities in Southern California, New York and Illinois could be affected. And UK inflation has increased for the second consecutive month, hitting 2.6% in November. It comes after the British Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced £40 billion of tax rises in the government's budget in October. Analysts believe the Bank of England will hold interest rates at 4.75% when it makes its decision on Thursday. Turning to sports now, and Manchester United boss Ruben Amorim says the club is better with Marcus Rashford. It comes after rumours the 27-year-old forward could leave Old Trafford after joining the squad's youth team as a teenager. United face Tottenham in their quarter-finals of the EFL Cup on Thursday. And legendary Indian spinner Ravichandran Ashwin has announced he's retiring from international cricket at the age of 38. Ashwin is the 7th highest wicket taker in Test history. He told a news conference in Brisbane he would like to concentrate on club-level cricket for the remainder of his career. A woman from the Philippines who spent almost 15 years on death row in Indonesia and was nearly executed by firing squad has now returned to Manila. She is now in a prison in the capital where she awaits a potential pardon from the president, Ferdinand Marcos, with Indonesia saying it would respect a decision to grant her clemency. Nina Puna has more.
A tearful reunion, 15 years in the making. Mary Jane Veloso was allowed to meet her family briefly at this women's prison after she was flown back to Manila on Wednesday. The 39-year-old mother of two embraced her now grown sons.
I thank God, finally all my prayers were answered today.
Mary Jane Veloso was arrested in 2010 in Indonesia and sentenced to death after the suitcase she was carrying was found to be lined with 2.6 kilograms of heroin. She has always maintained she was tricked into carrying the drugs by a recruiter who promised her a job as a domestic worker in Indonesia. In 2015, she was granted a last-minute reprieve from death by the firing squad, when the recruiter who allegedly planted drugs on Veloso was arrested in the Philippines and then charged with human trafficking. Earlier this month, Indonesia and the Philippines formally signed a deal to repatriate Veloso. Manila has long said that Veloso was a poor mother who made one desperate choice.
This shows a deep, strong and long-lasting relationship between the Philippines and Indonesia. She will be treated like an ordinary person, deprived of liberty in the Philippines in accordance with our laws.
For years, Veloso's case has also caused a huge outcry in the Philippines, with many saying that they saw themselves in her. A domestic worker forced to go abroad to escape crushing poverty at home. Veloso says she hopes freedom is not too far for her.
I have to go home. My kids are waiting for me, and I will celebrate Christmas with my family there.
Veloso is technically still serving out a life sentence in Manila, but Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos is expected to grant her clemency soon. Neha Punia, Al Arabiya News.
A reminder of our top stories. Russia says it has detained the person responsible for killing one of their top generals, Igor Kirillov. Aides of President-elect Donald Trump will travel to Kyiv in early January as the administration looks to end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And judges in France prepared to deliver their verdict in the Pelicot rape trial, the highest profile case the country has ever seen. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson. He's coming up with GNT. Good night.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to the show. From Australia to the US, 300 million people around the world live in jurisdictions that allow residents a choice to end their lives prematurely in order to escape the pain and indignity of a protracted death. The UK Parliament recently became the latest legislature to take a step towards legalising assisted dying in England and Wales. MPs were freed from party loyalties for an emotional, respectful debate that contrasted with the political combat that often punctuates the House of Commons. At its conclusion, a majority voted in favour of a bill that would permit some adults to use drugs prescribed to end their lives. But there were conditions. They would have to be diagnosed as terminally ill with no more than 6 months to live, mentally capable of making the decision, and free from coercion to do so. Well, the bill must pass several more rounds of intense scrutiny from parliamentarians before it can become law. But the issue sparked a passionate national debate with voices from different perspectives raising matters of ethics, faith and justice. At the same time, philosophers were preparing to cross continents for a conference in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, to discuss quality of life. In this episode, we'll consider attitudes to life and death from an ethical, practical and philosophical point of view. Dame Esther Rantzen is a celebrated British journalist and activist whose TV show, That's Life, ran for over 20 years, reaching audiences of more than 20 million viewers. Her campaigns have helped save children from abuse and the elderly from neglect. But now in her 80s, she's become a prominent figure in the campaign for assisted dying after revealing she's received a terminal cancer diagnosis. Her daughter and fellow campaigner, Rebecca Wilcox, joins me now. Rebecca Wilcox, it's really good to have some time with you, and it's sad that we're talking under these circumstances, but it's a very important subject. So for people like myself, we grew up seeing your mother, and half the country pretty much tuned into her every week on TV. And she was known as quite a staunch campaigner. Now, she bettered a lot of lives through those campaigns, and it seems she's taken on this one last campaign. I think you described it as her last campaign at your peril, something like that.
Yes, I said she doesn't want this to be known as her final campaign because there's still life in the old bird yet, is what she would say. And I would possibly get smacked over the head for saying that. Obviously, she doesn't agree with violence.
Now, the world got to know about Dame Esther's cancer when she revealed it on an interview that she had terminal cancer. And she also revealed that she was going to Dignitas, or signing up with Dignitas, the service in Switzerland that assists dying. Now, as your family would have already been aware, it seemed that her considerations were not so much for herself, but more about the impact it would have on the people around her, the people that she loved, perhaps facing prosecution for being involved in any way, as is the case with the law. So how did you and your family respond to your mother's decision?
It was an interesting one because whilst I've always been aware of her feelings towards end-of-life care and choice at the end of your life, I had no idea that she had signed up to Dignitas until she revealed it on a podcast. And I think a journalist rang me and asked me for a comment, which is pretty standard for growing up with my parents being in the public eye as they were. And so it wasn't a massive surprise, but it was, and it's in keeping with everything I know about her, but it was weirdly shocking because I felt that she wasn't near the end of her life. I felt that the treatment was going well. I love living in denial. It's not healthy. It's not good for you. I would never recommend it, but it helps me get through the day just to pretend that everything is okay. And the fact that she had gone about this with meticulous care and sorted out a future for herself that wouldn't hurt us showed how seriously she was taking this illness. I like to think of her as immortal and indomitable, and I think that was a bit of a shocking moment for me. I felt the rug pulled out.
There was also a massive reaction in the British media. There was a huge reaction with the public. Was Dame Esther surprised? Was she energized or perhaps concerned at being part of this debate?
I think she accidentally fell into this debate and then realized it was meant to be. She sort of has an ability for touching on the zeitgeist. So I would say that happened when she did Child Watch, and out of that came Childline, the helpline for children. And when she wrote an article about loneliness, she received so many letters in response to that she set up Silverline, which was a helpline for older people who were feeling similar feelings. And then she talked about this, and it was absolutely the right time for the country to start considering it again. It had been 2015 when it was last debated in Parliament. It had sort of plateaued. And I think she lit a fire under it. And once she realized that this decision that she made for herself could help other people, that's always been her goal. She's never done anything for herself at the detriment for other people. She suddenly realized this was a subject that needed talking about. It needed airing. We need to talk about end-of-life care. Even if you disagree with the assisted dying bill, we need to talk about what happens at the end of your life, because sadly we are all going to die. So your family need to know what you want, what care you want, what choices you want to make. And that's what this bill is about. It's about giving you further choices in that matter.
Rebecca, your mother's not known for doing anything half-heartedly. And apparently she contacted every member of parliament in the UK government before the debate. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She knew that she wasn't physically able to go to the debate. She sent me in her stead, and I sat at the top and sat on my hands and tried not to shout at people when I assumed that they were saying something that I disagreed with or she disagreed with me. And because she couldn't be there, she sent this heartfelt letter filled with comment and fact that she really hoped they would sit and listen to, because that's what she wanted. She wanted everybody in the room to listen to the other side, regardless of the point of view that you come into the room with. Listen to the other side and then make a choice. We know that the public are majority in favour of changing the rules around assisted dying. We just wanted that reflected in the room.
Now, Rebecca, your father, Desmond Wilcox, is also a renowned journalist and filmmaker. I gather both he and your mother had touched on this subject in documentaries in the past. Tell us about that.
They were trailblazers. They would go where subjects hadn't gone before. They didn't mind talking about the things that were difficult. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they covered this subject. Most recently, Mum made a series called How to Have a Good Death. And it was a really interesting eye-opener for her. And I think paved the way for this campaign, because she saw people suffer in a way that was not palatable, for want of a better word, and could not be helped by palliative care. She saw people's shunts fall out, and she saw people's morphine drop off, and she saw people's pain surpass the opioid barrier. And I think that created a deep-seated belief in her that she did not want to go that way, that she wanted something far more peaceful. And my father felt the same way. He had a DNR, he had a do not resuscitate, that was very clear. And I remember in the hospital when he was dying, they were trying to resuscitate him, and Mom was screaming at me on the phone because she had popped home to change her outfit. Not out of it, that sounds ridiculous. She popped home to refresh herself because we'd been there a few hours, and unfortunately she wasn't there as he started crashing. So she's screaming at me on the phone that he has a DNR, he has a DNR. And I wasn't able to, or I couldn't, some reason it felt wrong for me to stop the medical process, but actually that's what he wanted. And I really hope that I would be brave enough to do that now. But he never wanted to have a catastrophic brain injury from lack of oxygen, which was what was happening, and therefore live in a vegetative state. He wanted to have a good death, which is what the Health and Social Care Select Committee report talked about. And Mum absolutely echoed that. So their work throughout their lives always touched on difficult subjects and brilliant people talking about difficult things. And I'm not surprised they ended up with the decisions they ended up with.
It was a very difficult situation, of course, you found yourself in, and there are many perspectives on this subject, with some people very, very heavily opposed to it. They see it as assisted suicide, rather than just assisted dying. And I wonder, your mother would have heard a number of these arguments. Was she ever swayed by some of these viewpoints? Did it affect her in any way?
She has listened. She has listened. What she asked of the MPs to listen to her point of view, she has listened to other people. Otherwise, she is not the fair and rational woman that we know and love. She absolutely understands that people have differing points of view, that some people see that there's a sanctity of life, that some people see that there could be a coercive nature to this, that vulnerable elements of our society could be put at risk. But she and I have both looked through all the evidence and know that choice, according to the bill that has been set out, has an amazing set of safeguards around it. The safeguards are the cornerstone of this bill. At the moment, there aren't safeguards. At the moment, we're sort of living in a weird Wild West because nobody knows what to do and the law is a mess. So things can happen without regulation, whereas this would bring in regulation and legislation, and people would be able to monitor it very closely. I mean, it asks for the person that's asking to have an assisted death to apply 8 separate times. And those 8 separate times are scrutinised by doctors and lawyers or judges, depending upon how it proceeds with the committee stages. So there was no way that we didn't listen to other people's point of view, but the thing that kept coming back to us was this is choice, and faith is always choice. And I have many family members who are strong believers in the sanctity of life, but they would never believe that my mum should live in suffering and a prolonged existence just because of their faith.
Actually, you raise an interesting point there, Rebecca, and having spoken to people who are opposed to the bill, and you yourself will know the arguments very well, I'm sure, that issue of being coerced by others prematurely to end one's life, or even perhaps self-coercion came up, the idea that people might be guilty enough and feel that they need to end their lives because of pressure and burden they might put on others, came up also in the debate. And I wonder, did that issue ever come up among your family members?
What I would say about that is that there was an MP that stood up during the debate, and he said, this is not life or death, this is death or death. It was such a clear, bold statement that I hadn't heard before. I've heard people talk about this is not ending life, this is shortening death, but it makes it really clear that this is for terminal patients, people who have 6 months, 12 months left to live. It is not for somebody that is considered a burden on society. What a revolting phrase that is. Anybody that thinks they are a burden on society needs to have an adjusted view, because we need to value everybody, regardless of whatever supposed cost they may have. Everybody has a right to life. Kit Malthouse, the MP, said that we are not a nation of granny killers. And I think that is true. I think we, in the main, generally, absolutely adore our elders and respect them and look after them.
It's interesting, Rebecca, you raised that issue of safeguards, the safeguards that are there already, and the fact some are worried of the bill, allowing the scope to widen. And I wonder, if you could see any other potential safeguards that might really add another lock to the idea that the bill couldn't go any wider.
Well, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not very well versed in politics. I've come to this very green, and it's been a very steep education for me in how contrary points of view can cause such emotive arguments. I've had a lot of threats against my life, against my family's safety, just because I believe in choice at the end of this world. So at the end of your life. So it's an interesting one for me that you talk about safeguards, when the people that are throwing around the violent terms are usually on the opposite side to me. We turn up to every debate, every campaign, every rally. I'm alongside a campaign called Dignity in Dying, and that's exactly how we try and proceed at all these rallies, with dignity, with compassion, with empathy, and we're hugging each other and we're chatting to each other. And I'm alongside people who are really suffering from very serious terminal diagnoses, including this wonderful woman called Sophie, who has stage 4 terminal breast cancer and is allergic to opioids. So at the end of her life, she sees nothing but pain. She cannot have any pain relief. So how does the gentle death of palliative care work for someone like her? With the safeguards that we want, I think this is the most safe bill. In fact, there have been criticisms of it for having too many safeguards. I think at the moment, with the country not decided, with a bit of a rift going on, even though the majority are in favour of it, I think it's good to proceed with this level of safety at this time.
Referring to the stage where things are right now, you indicated your mother was unable to go for the first vote. You were there. How did both of you and your mother, react to the outcome?
It was so strange being there for the debate. I mean, it was a phenomenal moment that I will never, ever forget. It's an extraordinary place, as I'm sure you know, and it was filled to the rafters, which on a Friday is apparently quite unusual. There was not an ounce of seating left. And at the end of this very, very detailed debate that lasted 5 hours, and everyone said that was really short, I'm not sure I could have stood another 2 hours of it. But I know that there were more people that wanted to stand up and speak. But at the end of the debate, when they all went out to vote, and the speaker shouted out the results, and then there was silence. And I looked across to someone who was sat on the opposite side, who I knew supported my point of view, and he put 2 thumbs up. And I was so relieved he did, because the silence meant that I wasn't sure what had happened, because usually there's a hurrah from whoever wins. But it's such a serious subject. And at the end of the day, if we win, or, you know, it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like the ability to choose has been given to you to die. That is not something you cheer. Obviously, it's not. That's why it was taken so seriously. So I leapt out of the room and ran down the stairs. There is absolutely no phone signal anywhere in the Houses of Parliament. So I had to run to the river to get through to Mum, where I spoke to her, and I felt dizzy and sick and confused, and she and I were both echoing this. It's brilliant, it's amazing, thank goodness it's got through this stage, but wow, there's a lot of work left to do. Goodness, there were a lot of people that were putting up barriers to it already, and you know, and then she said to me, oh, I feel like I have to live for the next one now. I was like, yes, of course you do, but you don't have to live for the next debate. You have to live forever for us, your family, and maybe think about the debate.
You know, Rebecca, you said you talked about how your mother reacted when you called her, when you got out the Houses of Parliament to the River Thames to get a signal. And she said, you know, the next one is coming up. So, of course, I guess you both recognise that at this stage it could be passed, it could be amended, it could even fail. Doesn't, you know, having played such a big part in the campaign, doesn't your mother want to kind of take a step back and rest and enjoy the rest of her life?
I tell you, she says to me, I'm so bored with talking about dying. So I think she probably does, but I also think that she won't, because that's not the sort of person that she is. I don't think she'll let go of this. I think, you know, we've both received so many messages and letters and emails from families that are going through very similar situations to us, that don't have the privilege of being able to afford the £15,000 to fly off to Switzerland, that are facing whatever will happen here and have no way out, or who have been through it before, who have either been to Switzerland or who have come across a loved one who is attempting suicide or has a botched suicide attempt. There's so many awful stories that are rolling around our heads, and so many people that we know are dependent upon this bill, that I don't think there's any way that we could stop now. The next stage is very difficult. It's the committee stage. The bill will be gone through line by line by line. And I can only hope it gets through. It's weird how our country is so recalcitrant on this topic, whereas we are leaders in so many other areas of health and social care. So I just hope that we are a bit more open to another way of looking at this.
Your mother mentioned in a recent interview that you'll be hosting the family Christmas event this year. I mean, assuming she is able to come, what will Christmas with Esther Rantzen be like this year? And what memories do you have of Christmases together?
Yes, I'm going to be hosting my mum and my sister at some point over the Christmas period. They're going to come and stay. We haven't worked out the logistics yet, but I'm definitely, whenever that is, we'll have a massive turkey. I think I've ordered 3. I don't know how much turkey one person can eat, but her plate is going to be full. She doesn't have much of an appetite at the moment, but she's going to have every single trimming, every single type of stuffing, many types of Brussels sprouts, because we have quite a few opinions on how those should be cooked. Christmas with Esther is always fun. It's magical. She's naughty. She's brilliant. She's fun. She loves games. So we're going to play all sorts of games. I've got some fantastic new board games, competitive and not so. Anyone that takes her on in Scrabble, good luck to you. I have never won against her, but it's just going to be lovely. And I've bought her some excessively luxurious presents, which I hope she won't mind, and many gorgeous fluffy slippers. So please don't tell her I've done that too. And I'm decorating absolutely every surface of my house. There is not one vertical, horizontal, or diagonal that isn't covered in glitter and gold. So it's a bit much, but I love it.
I'm sure, Rebecca Wilcox, that pretty much everyone is wishing you and your family and your mother especially a wonderful Christmas celebration this year. Your mother, for people of my generation, I can say almost unanimously was a national treasure, has been a national treasure. And it's incredibly impressive that she's still doing so much to this stage. So more power to you, more power to her, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'll pass on the message.
Polls show that around 2/3 of British people supported the idea of legalising some form of assisted dying. But it's the members of Parliament who will ultimately decide whether and in what form such a law can proceed. The bill was brought before the House of Commons by the Labour Party MP Kim Leadbeater, who only entered politics 3 years ago after her sister Jo Cox MP was murdered. My next guest is also a Labour MP, but he voted against the bill. Barry Gardner's history of service spans more than a quarter of a century, and as he told me, his decision was made after much soul-searching. Barry Gardner, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, when you entered Parliament in 1997 as a young MP, what sense did you have you'd be involved in debates of such importance to the national conscience?
I think anyone who thinks about going into politics, national politics, has to realize that there will be times when they are considering issues which really are about life or death. In my own parliamentary career, I've had that on a number of occasions. We've had, obviously, debates on war. We've had debates previously on assisted dying. So it's something which everyone who goes into politics at that level really should have at the forefront of their mind. And they should have thought very deeply about it. And I think that was one of the features of the recent debate that we had. It was a very thoughtful debate.
You voted against the bill and spoke in the debate. What key points did you want to make?
I think it's important that we recognize that when we're legislating, we are not simply expressing our own personal preference. And this was the fundamental internal conflict that I had with myself, because I could envisage myself being in that situation as outlined in this bill, with perhaps 6 months yet to live, with a terminal disease, and depending on the nature of that disease, perhaps wanting to avail myself of what this law would propose, which is to be able to have an assisted death. So at a personal level, I could see that. And I also listened very carefully to the stories of many of my colleagues and some of my constituents whose family members had been in that position, but hadn't been able to avail themselves of an assisted death. Some who'd taken their own life, but hadn't been able to have their final goodbyes with their family, because that would have implicated their family in assisting suicide, which is a criminal offense. So I had to think very hard about, was it my role to enact a law which would certainly bring comfort and relief to those people? Or was it my role as a parliamentarian to pass legislation for the whole of society? And my fear was that if we passed the legislation that would undeniably bring that comfort and relief for so many, but I believe it would also have jeopardized those people who were, yes, in the situation at the end of their life with 6 months yet to live, but who thought, am I too much of a burden on my family? Should I just now opt for an early death? Is my living for another 6 months in this care home or with this care support going to eat so much up of the inheritance that my grandchildren might have on my death that I'm denying them their inheritance? And those are considerations that nobody at the end of their life should have to take into account.
Now, you're referring to guilt.
Misplaced guilt, because there is no guilt in living. You know, you're not guilty for being alive. You are a valued, a treasured human being. And where we lose our capacity to see each other as that, then our society really has changed fundamentally.
But Mr. Gardner, in terms of not having somewhere to go, there are people such as the famous British broadcaster Esther Ranson, who's in her mid-80s and suffering from lung cancer, who said if she doesn't have the option in the UK, she'll go to Switzerland, to Dignitas, an organisation that does offer assisted dying. So by not giving them the option in the UK, aren't you simply driving them out?
Well, no, it doesn't force them out, but what it does, unfortunately, and here I feel this very keenly, the point that you make, because as Esther Ranson wrote to me, as she did to many MPs, and her own witness, her own testimony of her situation was very powerful. And she made the point, I have the luxury, I am wealthy enough to be able to go to Switzerland, but there are people who are not. And therefore, at the moment, as the law stands, as a rich person, I can avail myself of the remedy that I want. I can exercise the choice that I wish to make, but a poor person cannot. And that's a very powerful argument. But as I say, I don't think it overrides the responsibility that I certainly felt to legislate for everyone in society and not just for those who felt themselves in that particular situation as wanting to have the assisted death.
It's interesting to note that this debate comes at a time when Britain has evolved into a multicultural and multi-faith society with representations of those groups in Parliament too. And I wonder, when it comes to religion and faith, in many cases assisted dying is seen as suicide, which is considered a sin, how those MPs were able to rationalise the debate in terms of their own beliefs.
The great thing about the debate was that it was incredibly respectful. No matter which side of the debate you were on, everybody listened with care and attention to what was being said. And obviously many people of faith were influenced by their faith. But that was why this was made a vote of conscience. It was not a whipped vote. It was not one that, and quite rightly, it should not be something that you say, oh, well, we have a manifesto commitment on something as deeply important to one's own sense of who one is, because this is one of the most deep ethical questions that one can have, and it was right that it was a free vote. So I think religion did not actually ostensibly play a part in the debate. People weren't saying this is prohibited by God, but obviously their own sense of where they stood in the debate probably was. But they then had to construct their arguments in a way that appealed to the wider audience who may not have shared their religious beliefs.
Supporters of the bill, such as MP Kim Leadbeater, point to the safeguards they tried to build in, such as 2 doctors, a judge, 6 months of life expectancy, and heavy jail sentences for those who might ill-advise or coerce someone into assisted dying. So you had talked about wanting another level of assurance. What would that be?
I think there was a recognition, not just from myself, but from others, that there needed to be additional safeguards. For example, the situation of the judge signing it off, that is really a technical formality. It's not there's no investigative powers that the judge has. He simply has to check whether 2 doctors have agreed. I'm afraid that my view on the way in which the medical profession might operate in this is that it is not even doctors who spoke in the debate accepted that 6 months was a very movable feast. Sometimes they give a prognosis, and that prognosis is entirely wrong. I think there was a concern that we would develop into 2 sets of doctors, those who were known to favor assisted dying and those who were not. And if you wanted that, you simply went to the ones who would sign you off without too much questioning. And I think that is it was a safeguard, but I don't think it was an adequate safeguard.
Well, Mr. Gardner, the House of Commons is often known as a bit of a bullpit with impolite yelling and jeering, whereas many people describe this debate as very respectful and deeply moving. It seems to be quite a contrast from the usual scenes.
Yes, it really was, and goodness knows, I wish many more debates were conducted in that tone. I have to tell you, I think what made it very evident was there was one member of Parliament who entirely misjudged the mood of Parliament. I won't name who it was, but he sought to make a political point in his contribution. He sought to make a political point about the government's recent announcement of winter fuel payments and the taking away of the winter fuel payments for people who were not on the lowest band of benefit. And the whole House groaned. It was a gut groan. It was and it seemed that all of Parliament, whichever side you were on, were saying, what are you doing? You're trying to turn this into a political debate. It's not. It's bigger than that, and we have to be bigger than that. And in that sense, I really think Parliament showed itself at its best because it was respectful. It was a debate which was characterized by listening and trying to respond seriously to the points that each other were making.
Yes, as you say, many people did describe this as parliamentary debate at its best. And I wonder what lessons could be learned from this, especially at a time when people around the world are starting to lose faith in politics.
Yes. Well, the obvious thing is let's have more free votes. Let's have more conscience votes. And perhaps MPs, instead of feeling that they have to troop through the lobbies after their whips, will think more deeply about the consequences of the legislation that they're passing. So I wouldn't like people to get the impression that the Commons is all, shallow and point scoring. It's not. But certainly this debate, I think, did the House proud. And even though I was on the losing side, I recognize that probably the majority of the British population, certainly in the polling that's been taken, were on the side of the bill. They wanted to see the bill go forward. And in that way, I have to respect democracy and hope that I'm wrong and that the fears that I have for this bill will not come to pass.
Sir, I understand that your parents died, sadly, while you were still very young. And I wonder if you believe that palliative care has sufficiently improved since then to be a viable alternative to the thought of assisted dying.
Look, I think everybody in that debate was clear that we need to improve palliative care in this country. Palliative care can be wonderful, and I've seen some marvelous examples in my own constituency and in my own personal life. My own father, as you mentioned, he died of esophageal cancer, which is a really ghastly way to die. And so I think we all understand that we need better palliative care. But I don't want to make the mistake of thinking that palliative care can alleviate everything. People in hospices do wonderful jobs, absolutely wonderful jobs. But I do understand why there are some situations for some people where assisted death does seem the only viable option. And that obviously is what the majority of members of the House of Commons felt.
Well, this moment has been compared with other parliamentary debates on sensitive matters such as same-sex marriage, abortion, the repeal of the death penalty. And I wonder how it sits alongside debates that Parliament has to conduct on economic and social and defence matters.
Oh, gosh. It's a very different thing. And that is why I think it has to be a vote of conscience, where every member of Parliament has the freedom to examine themselves, examine who they are, and examine who they feel the country ought to be, and to do the best for everybody in society. I often think of the writings of John Stuart Mill, the great libertarian Enlightenment philosopher of the 19th century. And he said a very strange thing, or people thought it was very strange. He said the reason that he was against the universal suffrage, the universal vote, was he believed that if everybody had the vote, then, and in those days it was only men, he said, men would come to regard the vote as an expression of their own private preference rather than as an expression of their public responsibility. Now, I think I disagree with his premise, because I think people always did use the vote as an expression of their own private preference. But it's a really fundamental principle that I think legislators need to always keep in mind. They're not legislating for what they would like. They're not legislating for what they think would benefit them or their particular group of people, or any particular group of people. They're there to legislate for the whole of society. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we lose really something that's very fundamental to our democracy. So these debates are very different. The debates you mentioned, ethical debates about the nature of life, the way in which our society regards life, when it begins, when it should end, how it should be conducted. Fundamental questions, very different from the education budget, very different from the issues of work and pensions and employment and industry, which we're doing all the time. But when you get that many serious people in a room taking the issue seriously, one has to hope that we arrive at a conclusion which does fit with our society and which does ultimately benefit the whole of our community.
Barry Gardiner, thank you very much for taking the time to give us your perspective on this debate. Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Barry Gardiner ended our conversation by describing how he finds philosophy to be a helpful resource when considering decisions on important issues, including matters of life and death. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles, about 6,000 kilometers from London, a global gathering of philosophers took place in Saudi Arabia. Quality of life was the main theme of the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, featuring a diverse group of prominent thinkers. I was keen to hear their thoughts on the issues that were being debated in Britain. Dr. Joseph Cohen, I'm very happy to have a chance to chat with you. What's interesting is we're here at a philosophy conference in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia looking at something called quality of life. When it comes to quality of life, where does the whole concept of assisted dying fit in?
Excellent question. First of all, thank you very much. Assisted dying. A very famous, important philosopher, Martin Heidegger, wrote in Being and Time, 1927, wrote that no one can take dying away from the person. No one can take someone's dying away from him or her.
A right to die.
That is, the experience of dying is always unsubstitutable. It cannot be taken away from anyone. My dying will be my own dying. Your dying will be your own dying, and no one will be able to take that away from you or I. So the experience of dying is a singular experience, right? The right to die is the right to live through that experience. That is, the right to confront the experience of dying. I believe that this confrontation is a confrontation of human existence. Human existence needs to confront this dying, because in this confrontation, it shows the possibility for the subject to project himself or herself into life.
But what's happened, Dr. Cohen, is that it's all become a legal matter now,
Right.
not a philosophical one.
Right.
And that's where the complications come in. Who has the right to be involved, whether it's family members, friends, whatever? What right does the person who wants to die have? It's a very sensitive topic, and I can understand it because it brings in ethics, religion, and everything else. But when it comes to the idea of this debate, what should be the angles we as a society, global society, should look at?
I think we should definitely entertain the possibility of respecting human finitude. I think one of the major challenges of our time is to confront the finitude of our human existence. And in a certain manner, I think a lot of the problems of our epoch are linked to the idea that we can think beyond human finitude. We can think ourselves as almost infinite. I think we need to refocus on the possibility for human rationality to truly look at what the meaning of life is, what the quality of life is, in the horizon of finitude. And in this sense, death, although it is the absolute master, to speak like Hegel, for example, German philosopher, death is the absolute master. Death may not be that which is a radical interruption of humanity. On the contrary, it may precisely be the revelator of that which projects humanity. You see?
I guess the argument is death may be inevitable for all of us, but who should have a choice on when that event occurs?
But you see, even that question, although I understand why we're posing it, even that question is impossible to answer. Death is impossible to determine. Death is one's own, and yet at the same time, it's not one's own. I will be given my death, even if it's my own. You will be given your death, and it will only be yours, but it's not yours to have.
Let's pretend you're a lawyer
Yeah.
defending someone who went through assisted dying.
Yeah.
How are you going to explain all this in court?
Yeah, it's obvious that the way I'm seeking to think the problem of dying is far removed from the idea of law, from the legal apparatus. Because I make a very sharp distinction between the law and justice. Perhaps being just towards death, towards the question of death, involves or engages our thinking beyond the law. That is, outside the sphere of law.
I think the UK, which is debating this right now, is in a very difficult position because, of course, it's combining religion, philosophy, ethics, and legality. If it's not too personal a question, would you opt for assisted dying?
Very, very complex question. Myself, and speaking strictly for myself, yes, I would. I think that confronting the question of death, confronting one's dying, is the most radical human experience. And in a certain manner, the courage it takes to confront that experience needs to be given to human finitude, needs to be allowed for in human experience. So yes, I would certainly give each and every one of us as human existence, as existing humans, the possibility to confront this experience of dying.
And yet, it's seen as a sin in so many societies.
Yes.
How do we rationalize that?
Well, I think, yeah, it definitely is seen as a sin, but I think we can understand a certain manner of thinking the religious, even the ethical, in relation to human experience, which would also involve the idea of confronting the experience of dying.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, really it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you. And I'm going to start by asking you about the debate that's going on in the UK right now regarding assisted dying. The reason being is that raises so many issues. And again, from a philosophical perspective, there's the ethics, there's religion, there's legality. What's your take on what's happening?
That's a very difficult question. I personally, I'm not attached to life. And I'd be perfectly happy to die right now. I mean, you probably like me to finish the interview.
Last 20 minutes.
Yes, I'll do my best. But so, for me, life is a wonderful thing. And yet, I don't have that sense. I have a sense of responsibility that I'm taking up space, I'm doing so on and so forth. Now, I entirely understand all the back and forth about the issues, that people could be pressurized to take death rather than continue when they don't want to. And that sounds like a horrible thing. But I also understand people who are in pain. So it's just a question of trying to find arrangements so that people can be confident in the system.
I can say honestly, in 10,000 plus interviews over the years, I've never had anyone say they could be happy to die right now. I mean, I've heard people say they're not scared of death. They're not worried about, death. It's an inevitability. But I'm just baffled. Sorry, I'm going to delve into this a bit, but just ask, where does this detachment from life come?
Well, I've just had a wonderful life. I mean, I'm
there's a
so
lot more,
blessed.
hopefully, isn't there?
Well, I'm 74 years old, so not that much more.
74 is young.
Yeah, to some people. I mean, no doubt if I do live to 94, I'll think about when I was 74 and think, oh, I was young back in those days. But no, I'm perfectly happy with the idea that I've had a great life. I think I've done some good things and some bad things, and I just don't want to ruin it. Aristotle says, you can only tell whether a person was happy, had eudaimonia is his word, after they're dead. And right now, I think I would be on the plus side. But maybe I'll go off and do something wrong and wish I'd died before this interview if I say the wrong thing today.
Professor Fausto Frisopi, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The big debate currently in society, certainly in the UK, is this concept of assisted dying. And what that does is it raises a lot of questions about what ethics are. From a philosopher's perspective, how do we set ethical boundaries?
So the problem is, in my view, don't fall in eugenetics. We already known from many decades ago. The problem is assisting dying is voluntarily or willingly asked from the patient. Why not? There is no ethic boundaries. But the ethic boundary will be strong or too strong when the society decide when is the case or not. And precisely where the point on which philosophy have something to say is if there is the case or not. It's not a matter of taxonomy if there is if it's the case or not, but a matter of general conception of life and when a life is worthy to live to the end, even with sickness, even with handicaps, and so on and so on. In my view, the extreme boundary and the extreme danger is the eugenetics. When a society settle taxonomies to say, okay, we can intervene for assisting that.
Let me get on to what has been the subject of this philosophy conference, quality of life, because that's actually the precursor to this debate.
Yes.
And I guess it comes down to how we judge quality of life. Now, there's obviously medical illness and serious conditions that warrant a different level of discussion. There's quality of life in terms of what people perceive as wealth or, capability, financial capability. What is quality of life in your terms?
There's a very sharp distinction in the history of philosophy between quantity and quality. Quantity, we all know, quantity is opulence, a mass of goods, and quality is something quite different. I think quality is the capacity to reveal what is singular in life, what is non-negotiable in life, what is radically singular and particular. Now, I believe that each and every one of us must think that problem of singularity through, must think the relationship between what is singular and what is qualitative. Now, if you ask me as a philosopher, I will tell you that what is most important in this qualitative ideal is time, temporality, how to use our time, how to think through the utilization of our time, of our temporality, as existence, but also our time with others, our time that we share with others in our communities, in our families, even in regards to our country, etc.
My mother, as a personal note, my mother went through years of Parkinson's disease, and at one point she said to me, as she was losing her physical capabilities, her mind was still sharp, she said, "This is not living, it's existence." That resonated with me. So how do we determine what a person is entitled to in terms of quality of life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because you're marking the distinction between life and existence. Now, perhaps I should make something quite obvious. Existence, the word existence, means actually to step out of oneself, transcend oneself. So it comes from the existence, it means to come out of oneself. I'm very attached to this idea. I'm very attached to this idea because I believe that human life must constantly and incessantly transcend itself. One must transcend itself, out of itself, into a betterment of oneself, into the qualitative ideal of a temporality that stretches out. The main problem for me when I think about the idea of quality of life is that we often reduce temporality. We often reduce temporality to a particular goal. I want such and such a thing. I want to achieve such and such a job. I want to achieve such and such a situation. We restrict temporality to succeeding in a particular goal or a particular appropriation of a goal. I would rather, and remaining faithful to this idea of existing, I would like us to think quality of life as stretching out time.
This leads me almost perfectly onto where society has gone in terms of quality of life. I mean, many people, myself sometimes also, bemoan the fact that we've become so short-term in our thinking. We have lost as society our understanding of the difference between need and want.
Yes.
And it's driven very much by want, so much more than need. And that kind of detaches us from the real needs on this planet, between societies and cultures and so on. So when we think of quality of life in those terms, how can we bring ourselves back to understanding these differences? When you have a conference looking at the quality of life, how do you get people to consider this and not think short term and materialistically?
Yeah, no, I think I mean you're putting your finger on a very important topic, and I think a topic that will be discussed throughout our conference. That is, how can we instill in our lives, in the quality of our lives, the possibility to invent or to think outside the box, to be very pragmatic in my speech. That is, think outside the box, invent outside the determined modalities of our thinking. You were asking me about where has society gone. I feel today, politically, sociologically, anthropologically, even geographically, I feel that we have reached a point where our humanity is extremely determined in the simple repetition of inherited ideas. I believe what we need is to reinvent these inherited ideas.
But what are these inherited ideas based on?
They are based on a tradition, and I'm all for the enhancement of our tradition, but I'm also thinking that our humanity, and this is why I'm so attached to this project here in Riyadh, is that we are incessantly seeking to reinvent our tradition. That is, take our tradition and our different traditions. It's an international conference. People from all walks of life, not only philosophers, scientists, not only people from the Middle East, but also people from all over the world are coming to Riyadh to take what our traditions have given us and invent a commonality of humanity. And this is what I feel and fear we have lost in many of our societies. The power to invent and reinvent what we receive.
The conference, the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, the theme for this year has been quality of life. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, where this fits into what you might define as quality of life.
Well, in my talk, I talked about how the quality of life has become the slogan in well-being league tables put out by the World Health Organization and other similar organizations. And I just feel that they have entirely missed the point. That too easily this becomes an instrument for governments to be competing against each other, to be higher up in the league table. They're more likely to go higher up in the league table if they're keeping the middle class happy rather than addressing poverty or systemic issues like climate change. And so I just think that the whole emphasis is wrong. And so in my talk, I was talking about poverty and hunger, and why I would prefer to see that as the issue, and global poverty. It shouldn't be countries competing against each other to be better than the other one. We should be trying to pull up the people who need the most help.
So when it comes to the term quality of life, what's your definition of it?
Oh, I don't have a definition. I'm not that kind of philosopher, thankfully. So I just think the phrase, which basically, not many people know this, but it gained currency because President Lyndon Johnson used it in a talk he gave in Madison Gardens. Yeah. Thank you, yes, in 1964. And then all these economists went off and thought, oh, that's what we should be talking about, not GDP, but quality of life. And so that's why they tried to measure it and so on. But I think that, again, it's always going to be different for different people and different cultures. And I think trying to make this a competition is a mistake.
Do you find the world of philosophy is a shrinking one?
Oh, that's a very provocative, in its own sense, it's a very provocative question. At times, I do feel philosophy is shrinking. That is, I do feel philosophy is becoming ever more so specialized and structured only on the repetition of its own tradition, which is an extremely rich tradition. And certainly we need that form of specialization in universities and research centers. And I'm a professional philosopher, so I'm not going to criticize that. But at the same time, I do feel that what philosophy really needs and how philosophy can really help, because we always say philosophy cannot help our society, they're abstract and they're living in their ivory towers in Cambridge and Oxford or wherever, but where philosophy can really truly help is to develop and deploy in what is common, what is to reveal in what is common, what is singular. That is, from where we can reinvent ourselves. I think philosophy has a task today to insist on the reinvention of our humankind.
Is the problem that philosophy is considered elite? Is that the issue?
No, it's one of the problems. It's one of the problems, and I think philosophy has a great responsibility in that elite manner of appearing, and I think philosophy must, in a way, come down from that elite status and become much closer to our everyday life. But at the same time, I would never want philosophy to let go of its radicality, and its radicality is what? Its radicality is, again, the possibility for the subject to transcend itself, for the human subject to transcend itself, to become other than itself, to reinvent itself.
Do you, as a philosopher, often change your ideas, your philosophies?
Constantly. And I think, if I may be a little bit provocative even about philosophy, I think one of the great dangers of philosophy and of philosophy as a discipline is to always pretend that coherence is the sole motivator for human beings. I think there is a value to uncoherence, to the possibility of constantly and incessantly changing to adapt to our singular existential situations. The situation of 1968, is not the same situation in 2024. We need to have not only evolved from 68 to 2024, but rethink the very concepts that were used in 68, rethink those concepts for 2024. That means constantly and incessantly change.
Do you think there has been a change in this global society that's now being created by the internet, the World Wide Web, interconnectivity at a global level? Is there a change in philosophy? Is there a better exchange of understanding of ideas?
Yeah, I would say the culture interact when there is, at first and foremost, commercial exchange. So the beginning of the Renaissance, the rise of Columbus, and the rise of the companies to the east, the Jesuit company already increased the knowledge from the west to the east, and so on and so on. Now we live in a globalized world. This is my matter of study, in a complex world. And in this case, of course, technologies can help to a dialogue. But I will say as a platform, not as a form of dialogue. The dialogue must be established person to person in such conferences, in long dialogues, not with smart messages and all what the platforms provide to us.
Thinking of different cultures, is philosophy as a subject, is it universal, or is it very much divided along cultural lines and, I guess, religious lines, ethnic lines?
Well, obviously there's been a huge variety of philosophies, and I'm not a mainstream philosopher. I've done quite well. I got a job, but I'm not one of those people who is trying to conform to whatever the fashion is. So quite honestly, I think a lot of current philosophy is not very interesting. I think it's geared towards an academic audience. It doesn't know how to get beyond that. It's geared towards trying to publish as many articles as possible. So I think philosophy has lost its way. And one of the luxuries of having a job with tenure is that I can do what I want.
What would be your version of what philosophy should be then?
I think it should be trying to hear voices from more different people. And that's why I think that to a certain extent, what we call Western philosophy is somewhat played out, at least in terms of what it's become. I'm not denying the wonderful classics that I enjoy studying. So I'm not one of these people against the great books, as it were. But I do think that if we could hear more from people from India, from Saudi Arabia, from Algeria, wherever, I just think that that is what will refresh and renew philosophy, because it's coming from different conditions, different contexts. People have different intuitions depending on where they're brought up.
Well, my intention would be to speak with you a lot longer, but I'm going to ask you a final question as we are running out of time. And that would be, is philosophy as a concept, as a source of inspiration and kind of debate in society, is it dying?
I want to make a very firm distinction here. I think if I look at academic philosophy as it's practiced in many elite institutions, I would say it deserves to die. If you look at the issues that ordinary people have that we need to introduce or reintroduce back into philosophy, then it'll never die.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, what a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
I enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Professor Versopi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you too.
Thank you, sir. Well, Dr. Joseph Cohen, what a pleasure. You provoked a lot of thought here, I hope, with the people watching. Certainly have with me. Real pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Some thoughts there on how the ancient tradition of philosophy can be applied to very current issues that are being passionately debated in some parts of the world today. Thanks to all my guests for their respectful, considered and sensitive contributions they brought to this episode. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, with talks in Cairo reported to be making progress, there's growing optimism that Israel and Hamas could be on the brink of agreeing on a ceasefire deal. Ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration next month, we'll be speaking to the US President-elect's pick for counter-terrorism chief, Sebastian Gorka, about how the incoming administration will manage global and domestic threats. In its annual report, the International Rescue Committee says that Sudan is the biggest humanitarian crisis ever recorded. We'll be speaking to the CEO and president of the IRC, David Miliband. And with his inauguration looming, we'll be discussing President-elect Donald Trump's chances of bringing about that swift end to the war in Ukraine that he pledged throughout his campaign. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Gaza, where optimism over a possible ceasefire with Israel is at an all-time high since the start of the war in October of last year. Well, Hamas officials are also saying that reaching an agreement is, quote, possible. This as the US joins forces with regional mediators Egypt and Qatar to advance those talks. Well, while previous attempts at a ceasefire have not delivered lasting results, there is significant momentum and a flurry of diplomatic activity right now, and that's raising hopes of the prospect. Well, Donald Trump, who will become the US president next month, has issued a stern warning calling for the release of all remaining hostages still being held in Gaza by the time of his inauguration in January.
On Bibi, we had a very good talk. We discussed what is going to happen, and I'll be very available on January 20th, and we'll see. As you know, I gave warning that if these hostages aren't back home by that date, all hell's going to break out, and very strong. But we generally just discussed, I asked him, where are things? Mike Waltz they're doing a great job, by the way. Everybody is very happy. I think he's doing a fantastic job. but he was very much involved in the call. But it was a recap call more than anything else.
President-elect Donald Trump speaking there. Well, even as the talks progress, Israeli strikes continue in parts of Gaza. Well, the latest strikes today alone have claimed 16 Palestinian lives, pushing the death toll above the 45,000 mark there in Gaza since the war broke out on the 7th of October of last year. Well, to get more on the ceasefire talks and the possible impact on Israel, Gaza and the region, we're joined by the former secretary of the Israeli delegation for the Camp David negotiations, Gidi Grinstein. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. It sounds, doesn't it, like those talks in Cairo are making some progress. Could the 14-month-old war in Gaza be about to pause or even end?
Thank you very much for having me. It does seem that we're getting closer and closer to a very significant deal. It's not a deal that ends the war, but it is a deal that shrinks the conflict, perhaps gets a ceasefire. There are a few outstanding issues here that have to be addressed, that still have to be resolved. First is the prisoners versus the hostages, right? The Palestinian side wants more prisoners and what we call heavyweights, meaning people that have been convicted of murders or mass murders, etc. And in this case, obviously, the issue is how many of them will be released and whether those heavyweights will be exiled. And if they're exiled, where are they going to be exiled to? On the receiving end, on the Israeli side, the issue is how many hostages are going to be released right now. There is a perception in Israel that the hostages that remain behind may not survive the winter, meaning another long term in the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. So there is a pressure in Israel to bring as many of them as possible home right now. We also have to remember the context. There is a very important Jewish holiday coming up next week. And then there is obviously the Christian holidays and the end of the year. So there is that kind of time pressure to bring the deal together. The other thing that I believe is very central in the negotiations is the whole mechanism of reaching a ceasefire and eventually transitioning into the day after and the long-term situation, what we call the political horizon in Gaza. Because one of Hamas' demands is that Israel will withdraw from Gaza altogether. Israel is saying, we're not letting go of the security perimeter and other key security issues in Gaza. We cannot be exposed, again, to an attack by Hamas, which brings us to the third issue, and that is the political transition in Gaza, because Israel rejects any notion of continued Hamas control of Gaza. In this case, Israel itself is not clear about what it wants, because Israel ruled out Hamas. It also ruled out Fatah, which is the other major leading Palestinian party. It also ruled out the Palestinian Authority. So effectively, Israel has not come forward with any mechanism for governing Gaza post-Hamas, which is part of the void that has been created in Gaza, which is why it's easier for Hamas to stay in power in that kind of situation. So I believe that all of these things together are now being discussed, and hopefully it looks like we're moving towards some sort of a deal in the next few days, I hope, hopefully within a week.
Okay, so clearly some sticking points remain, none of them particularly new. Yeah, as you say. And Hamas wants any immediate deal to pave the way for a comprehensive deal. So this is kind of the deal before the big deal, if I've understood correctly. And I'm just wondering what you think the focus would be between this immediate deal and the more comprehensive deal.
So right now, I believe that there will be some sort of a ceasefire for a few weeks, within which there'll be a talk about the next phase. I believe that the next phase is quite clear. What we have today in the West Bank is a division of the West Bank into three types of areas. Area A, which is fully controlled by the Palestinians. Area B, where Israel has security control and Palestinians have civilian control. Altogether, 40% of the West Bank. And then you have Area C, about 60% of the West Bank, where Israel has security and civilian control. The solution for Gaza, I believe inevitable, is to divide Gaza into Area A and Area B, meaning there will be some areas that will be controlled by the Palestinians and other areas, about 20% of Gaza, that will remain Area B, meaning under Israeli security control for a transition period of a few years. Probably it makes sense to speak about 4 years, which is the term of President Trump. So once you have area A and B in Gaza, the significance is that according to the Oslo Accords, area A and B will be Palestinian in permanent status, meaning once you divide the area of Gaza into these categories, you're actually saying that in the long term, all of Gaza will be Palestinian. There'll be full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza when the conditions are right. Also, it allows the Palestinian Authority or the PLO to invite the international force, Arab-led, with American participation or without American participation, with UAE leadership, Saudi leadership, whatever it is. Then once you define that 80% of Gaza, for example, is area A, meaning it's Palestinian, you are unlocking the mechanism that allows to bring in the international force and the security forces of the Palestinians that can begin to fill the vacuum in Gaza and replace Hamas. Another thing we have to remember here is that effectively in Gaza right now there is a legal void. Once Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it took with it the legal system that was attached to its presence there. When Hamas came into power, it canceled the existing agreement. Hamas is no longer in power, so there is a void in Gaza. So we have to reignite the Gazan legal system and the Gazan economic system in the day after the war. So obviously, all these questions that I'm sharing with your viewership right now, they're not being negotiated right now. But this is the day after in the negotiations. The moment there is a deal and there is a ceasefire, and we're beginning to talk about what's next, these issues are going to be very prominent.
Yeah, I mean, for people who are listening and saying, we've kind of been here before, haven't we? Why is there more optimism now than there would be than there had been in previous occasions when, in fact, there turned out to be no deal at all? I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps there are some answers to that question. I mean, obviously, President Biden has only got a month left in office, and that's added some sense of US momentum. And Hamas has been degraded to such an extent that they're weakened and maybe their negotiating positions have softened somewhat. Do you agree with either of those assessments?
Yes, I think, Tom, I think you captured most of it, at least on the Arab side and also on the American side. Let's start with the American side. You put a segment with President Trump. President Trump is bringing some sort of a new energy to multiple arenas around the world. He's very adamant about his policies coming in. He's very assertive about what he wants before coming into office. And that creates a lot of energy. Also, I have to commend the way in which the Biden administration is working with the Trump administration on these issues, meaning the Biden people are still in power and they are leading. But they're, I believe, closely coordinated with the Trump people. And I think this is really very important for the process. Second, you spoke about Hamas. Hamas, for a long time, since October 7, was hoping for what they call the unification of the fronts, meaning Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, everything coming together. Meanwhile, more than a year later, Hezbollah is beat up. Iran has suffered a significant setback. Assad is no longer there. The Houthis have been hit. So Hamas is alone. Hamas calculations, strategic calculations, have been compromised. So in many ways, their hands are, their hand is weaker. Plus, there's a lot of reports about very significant popular uproar and anger at Hamas in Gaza. There was just a story I read yesterday that a very senior representative of Hamas in Cairo, was badly beat up by Gazans who he accidentally met in the mall. There's a lot of anger from Gazan population against Hamas. The third thing is Israel. You're looking at a prime minister who now has a wider coalition, which means that he's less accountable. He's less held by the far-right factions of his government, and he feels the ability to move forward, more flexibility to move forward. The other thing is in Israel is that there is pressure from the military that right now is saying to the prime minister, our mission in Gaza is not clear. The war has basically ended. Our forces are standing there. We are sitting targets. We're doing incursions here and there. But what is the goal of the war in Gaza? And many Israelis are asking that. So there is a bottom-up pressure in Israel to get the deal. Let me just mention, for those of you who are not following what's going on in Israel, the pressure of the hostage families on the government is immense. Every day there are demonstrations by thousands of people sometimes just to demand the release of the hostages. So there's pressure bubbling up in Israel. The Hamas hand is weaker. Americans are moving much more decisively toward the deal. I think the Americans always wanted the deal, but now they're very decisive. So all of these things are getting us closer and closer to a position. Last, I'll say that I think there's also a change in the positions in the negotiation of both Hamas and Israel. Israel is willing to do more. Hamas is demanding a little less, so we're closer.
Yeah, well, Hamas is saying a deal is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
I think that in international negotiations, a lot of times you work from principles to details. So we agree on a general principle, let's say a prisoner exchange, and then we begin to exchanging prisoners for hostages. And then we begin to talk about the details, and the details bring up more issues. So every side, one side or the other side, can say these are new demands. But in fact, it's part of the dynamics of going from principles to details. I believe that also on the Palestinian side, there have been differing demands. Obviously, Hamas now is on its back foot, so its ability to actually make these demands from Israel is weaker. But still, in the past, we saw Hamas changing their positions, wanting different prisoners released from the Israeli jails, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, I believe that the pressure is moving toward a deal, and the Qataris are leaning in, the Egyptians are leaning in, the Americans are in, Israel and Hamas are closer in their positions. So I think a lot of Israelis, present company included, are hopeful that there will be a deal.
Indeed, and it seems to be a case of the Biden administration wanting something to be able to report with regards to the legacy of President Biden, and certainly the incoming administration wanting to make a mark as well. And with that in mind, you talk about the cooperation between these two administrations, and an example of it is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting this week Adam Boehler, who is Donald Trump's special envoy for hostage affairs. I mean, I just wonder what sort of a difference of approach you think this new administration is going to bring?
First of all, the new administration will have a lot of catching up to do in terms of the details. Managing these negotiations is an extremely intricate business, and it requires a lot of knowledge. Even when you look at the Biden team, the expertise, the core expertise of the Biden team was not on the Palestinian issue. It was more focused on, Syria, ISIS, etc. These were perceived as the main challenges that faced concerns of America. The Palestinian issue was seen as a dormant issue, a very benign conflict, not too many casualties. I'm talking prior to October 7th. And then it takes time to catch up. So I think, first of all, we have to be modest about the ability of the Trump team, the new Trump team, the newly appointed Trump team, to make kind of nuanced and targeted interventions. I do want to mention that there is a very veteran team around Trump, which was led by Jared Kushner, who's involved, but he's not involved in these issues. I believe, by the way, that Jared Kushner will be involved in kind of the diplomatic architecture that will come out in the Middle East following the war. Probably is already doing it right now. And in terms of change of policy, I think that what Trump has that Biden does not have is Trump published a peace plan. And I invite your viewership to review it. January 2020. It's a very substantive and serious plan. The Palestinians rejected it out of hand, which I think was a very big mistake. What the Palestinians should have done was to mark it up. But this plan actually offers a vision for a two-state solution. And the precondition for discussing this plan is the removal of Hamas. Now, 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, it was seen as a fantastic demand that's never going to happen. But right now, we're moving in the direction of Hamas no longer being in power, which means that Trump actually has a political platform to work with, which speaks about the principle, as I said, of two nation states for two people, expanding Gaza in order to allow its development, the connection. Gaza and the West Bank is a single territorial unit, which has been a fundamental principle of Israeli-Palestinian political process since the 1990s, and Palestinian state a vision for a Palestinian state in the West Bank. All of these things are in the Trump plan. So I think that there could be a moment where Trump is basically saying to everybody, look, I have this plan, which I published in January 2020. I want everybody to look at it. And that could be the basis for the political process, what we call toward the political horizon that everybody is talking about.
Okay, well, we'll have to see. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Gidi.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Turning our attention now to the United States, where there's just over 1 month to go until the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Well, a subject of considerable discussion on both sides of the aisle there in the US has been the cabinet appointments that will be central to the incoming Trump administration. Well, amongst the picks, Sebastian Gorka, the president-elect's nomination for Director of Counterterrorism, who served briefly in the first Trump administration. Well, he'll be taking up that new role at a time of uncertainty in several areas of the world, including in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and at a time when some say the US is more divided than ever before. Well, Dr. Gorka joins us now from Washington. Thank you so much for speaking to us. You've been nominated, as I said, as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism. Congratulations on that. Just tell us, how did this appointment come about? Did Mr. Trump call you himself?
Well, let me just first say that it's not quite cabinet level. Thank you kindly. Usually that's for secretaries. But yes, I will be in the White House running counterterrorism for the president and for the incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. How did it come about? About a year and a half before the election, I traveled to Mar-a-Lago to talk to President Trump about what I could do to support him and the America First agenda, should we be so lucky to have him reelected. And then, yes, about half an hour before the announcement was officially made, he called me from Mar-a-Lago and he said, Sebastian, get ready. It's about to become official.
Okay, so it didn't come as a complete surprise, I take it.
No, not completely. Not completely. He said he wanted me back for a second administration in that term. And then about a week or 10 days before the nomination was actually official, there was a gathering at Mar-a-Lago where he saw me in the crowd and he said in front of a few hundred people, we're going to give Seb a very special job. And somebody recorded it on the ubiquitous cell phone and uploaded it onto social media. So it wasn't quite as much of a surprise as even I had expected.
Okay, well, you are indeed, as we've been saying, taking up that senior role, Director for Counterterrorism. Just wondering what you're going to bring to the role.
About 30 years of doing this. So I've spent my career in national security studying the ideology and the strategy of global jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Hezbollah, Hamas. I've trained the US military, law enforcement, the intelligence community. So now it's going beyond the theory and the training aspect to the actual policy coordination for the US government in counterterrorism.
Just to be clear, I mean, on a formality, this is a role that doesn't require Senate confirmation, does it? So there are no hoops for you to jump through, so to speak.
Well, only the internal ones. Everybody who works for the president has to be vetted both politically and in terms of security clearance. I have maintained my top secret security clearance since I left government, so that's even less of a hurdle for me. But no, everyone who works inside the White House, who works inside the National Security Council as a political appointee of the president does not require Senate confirmation.
Okay, we've been talking a lot on this channel, Al Arabiya News, about the new lineup in the Trump administration, who's in, who's not in. Just wondering what your thoughts are as to when you look at that lineup, what's going to be achieved when Donald Trump gets back to the White House?
Everything will be achieved that is required to make all Americans prosperous and safe, whether or not they voted for President Trump, whether or not they're amongst the 77 million who said, yes, after the disastrous Biden-Harris 4 years, we want President Trump back. If you look at the picks, they're all people who have proven themselves, people who know each other. I mean, it's not a secret. I'm friends with Kash Patel, the incoming director of the FBI. Likewise, Tom Homan, the real border czar who is coming in to work for President Trump to replace that disaster who was Kamala Harris as putative border czar. So this is a group of people who understand President Trump, understand the mandate of 77 million votes, popular and electoral college. And these are people who are committed to one thing and one thing above all else: America first and making America great again. That's the big difference, on top of the fact that we will not permit seditionist, traitorous individuals into the building, like former Chief of Staff John Kelly, like Colonel Vindman, who actually committed felonies by leaking classified information to the mainstream media to undermine and sabotage the president. That will not be happening in the second Trump administration.
What do you think are going to be your top priorities, your top concerns as you take up that position? And I'm talking here specifically with regards to counter-terrorism efforts.
Well, you can split the terrorist threat into two very obvious baskets: the intrinsic, the internal, and the extrinsic, the external. So what we have inside America, continental United States, is an unbelievably heightened terrorist threat thanks to the feckless lack of leadership of the Biden-Harris administration. They literally dismantled our border, made sure we had no national sovereignty. As a result, the official Biden figures are that 8 million illegals were allowed into the country in the last 4 years. If you add to those the gotaways, people who were not in contact with the authorities as they crossed the border, you can double it to about 16 million at least. If only 1% of that 16 million are malefactors, are cartel members, foreign agents, terrorists, then we are talking about divisional-sized assets. So the primary concern for Kash Patel, for Governor Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, for Tom Homan as the border czar, is to identify the most dangerous terrorist threats who are inside America already, thanks to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and to neutralize them and to get them out of America. The external threat, sadly, is very simply the recrudescence of global jihadism. We saw what happened in October the 7th with the slaughter of the innocents in Israel. And now we see the collapse of Syria provide new opportunities for the global jihadi movement, even if they try to relabel themselves as moderates. Global jihadism is on the rise. Thanks to Joe Biden's lack of leadership, that will be our two primary baskets of terrorist threats.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about events in Syria. Obviously, Bashar al-Assad is out after his family ruled the country for 54 years. HTS is in. Do you think the United States should reconsider that group's designation as a terrorist organization?
I'm not going to steal the thunder of my past and future boss, President Trump, nor Colonel Mike Waltz, the incoming National Security Advisor, or the Secretary of State. Foreign terrorist designations are done through the State Department. So, Senator Rubio will be heavily involved in any FTO designations. But let me tell you, as somebody who's studied jihadis for about 30 years, there has never, ever been a case since the establishment of the Ikhwan after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk dissolved the original caliphate after World War I. There has never been a modern jihadi leader who suddenly became a moderate after decapitating Christians and Jews and apostate Muslims or burning Jordanian fighter pilots alive in cages. None of these leaders said, "Oh no, I love Jews and Christians" the next day, or apostate Muslims who disagree with us, they're fine. Never happened in history. So let me just leave it at that. The idea that, a jihadi leader who was a part of ISIS slightly trims his beard and says, "I'm a good guy now," hasn't happened in the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement.
Indeed, but not all of that can be applied to Ahmed al-Shara, or also known as Mohammed al-Julani, who promises to be representative and inclusive in.
Why can't it be applied to him?
You don't believe what he's been saying and the overtures he's been making?
People don't lie. Brutal jihadis don't lie. Is that what you're telling me? Or are you telling me you're looking into his soul and you know whether he's telling the truth or not?
I'm not saying I'm looking into his soul. I'm asking whether you believe him when he says he's going to form an inclusive leadership there in Damascus.
Well, I think I answered the question, didn't I? In the last 100 years of the modern global jihadi movement, from the Ikhwan to Al-Qaeda to Daesh. There has never been a jihadi leader who became a moderate just because he said so. So draw your requisite conclusions.
So the UN envoy has been in Damascus this week. Various European diplomats have been in Damascus this week. Some flags have been hoisted above embassies in Damascus this week. Do you think it's not better that there should be dialogue with this new leadership in Damascus than no dialogue at all?
You're kind of going around in circles, or I'm not sure you're listening to what I said. In the history, the 100-year history of the modern jihadi movement, since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood, there has never been a prominent jihadi leader who became a moderate. Never happened. So that's my take on what we're witnessing in Syria. And I don't speak for other US nations. I don't even speak for America. I'm a private citizen until 12:01 on January the 20th. And I'm not speaking for President Trump either. But the idea that the United Nations did something, you mean the organization that is predominantly famous for having its blue helmets rape children in Africa? Let me just say, I'm really not interested in what the United Nations may or may not be doing right now in terms of jihadism, because they don't have a very preeminent track record in that domain.
So your assessment of Syria's future, I mean, from what I'm hearing, doesn't sound very optimistic.
Well, it's completely fluid. It's an utterly plastic situation right now. I mean, God bless Israel for what they've done to secure their country after the biggest loss of Jewish life since the end of the show, at the end of the Holocaust in 1945. There are numerous actors in the region, whether it's the Kurds in the north, whether it's the Druze in the south, whether it's the Arab militias who are anti-jihadi. These are all actors involved in that region right now. If anybody tells you they know what the future of that benighted country is, they're lying to you. So I have one request for Christmas. I would like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Jake Sullivan not to do anything in the region, because they've created enough chaos and carnage in the last 4 years, and wait until the adults who actually know what they're doing are back in control at 12:01 on January the 20th.
Okay, so in your capacity as a private citizen, could I ask for your opinion? The $10 million bounty on the head of al-Jilani, should that be removed?
Not appropriate for me to comment, given my incoming position.
Okay. You mentioned your strong support for Israel. There are reports coming out of Cairo, quite promising sounding reports, that a ceasefire deal could be fairly imminent with regards to the continuing war in Gaza. I just wonder what you make of those reports.
What I said when I saw the unedited 47-minute video of what the jihadists of Hamas did on October the 7th. I want Israel to kill everybody responsible for the rape and murder of women and children and the killing of unarmed men on that day. We are in a civilizational war between decency and barbarity. On the one side, Judeo-Christian civilization and our Muslim allies and partners in the Middle East. And on the other side, those who believe that decapitating innocent journalists live on camera like Daniel Pearl because they're American and Jewish is okay. I am wearing a bracelet from the families of the hostages I met a week ago, some of whom are American citizens. And it says, bring them all home now. This is an absolute outrage that we are, a year and a half away from that atrocity, and we still have those in captivity, Jewish and American, who are being used as bargaining chips by individuals who have an ideology that negates the right of existence for a whole civilization and whole nations. That's where I stand. I stand with decency against barbarity.
And what would you say would be the best way to go about getting those remaining hostages home?
It's exactly what President Trump said, and it is what the families of those hostages told me. They have had more than 100 visits with the Biden administration since October the 7th, more than 100, to no avail. And they said to us, they said to me, the one social media post from President Trump a week and a half ago, where he said that if the hostages are not released by the time of his inauguration as the President of the United States for a second term, and in capital letters he wrote, there will be all hell to pay. That is a promise President Trump will keep.
We're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, I mean, it's after 7 months, I think it was, in the first Trump administration, you resigned. You said that forces, quote unquote, in opposition to Trump's policies had forced you out. I'm wondering whether you think those same forces are going to be present in the second Trump administration.
I think I addressed that about 12 minutes ago. I said one of the biggest difference between now and then is that we will not allow subversive saboteurs into the building, such as John Kelly or Colonel Vinderman, who did everything they could to undermine the mission of President Trump to represent the will of 64 million Americans back then. Now it's going to be 77 million Americans who gave him a mandate. So no, one of the biggest differences is we will not have traitorous individuals like General Kelly or Colonel Vinmer inside the building undermining the writ of the American people.
Just lastly, you didn't mention John Bolton there, and I'm sure you've read...
Oh, John Bolton's not worth my time. He's a clown. He's an utter clown who goes on CNN. What self-respecting Republican goes on CNN to bash his former boss? He's a sad little man with a laughable clown's moustache, so don't give him any oxygen, because I'm not going to.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Now, according to the International Rescue Committee, there are currently 305 million people around the world who are in need of humanitarian support. Well, in their 2025 annual emergency watch list, the IRC has listed Sudan as being the biggest humanitarian crisis ever recorded, accounting for 10% of all the people in humanitarian need globally. That is despite the fact that the country is home to just 1% of the global population. Well, for the first time in several years, Syria has now re-entered the top 5 countries of concern. Well, let's get more on this now, and we can speak to David Miliband, the CEO and President of the International Rescue Committee and the former British Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Mr. Miliband. The International Rescue Committee, of course, responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises. You've just published this IRC annual emergency watch list. For the benefit of people who don't know, just tell us, what does this watch list reveal?
The International Rescue Committee is a humanitarian charity working to combat the consequences of war and disaster around the world. And each December, we do a statistical analysis of about 70 to 80 indicators, quantitative and qualitative, to rank the 20 biggest looming humanitarian catastrophes, the countries in which there are the greatest number of people in humanitarian need. In total around the world today, it's about 305 million people who depend on non-governmental organizations, charities, to survive. 3 of the top 6 are in the Middle East region, in Gaza and the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territories, in Syria and in Lebanon. But top of the list is Sudan, which has 30 million people in humanitarian need. So the watch list is both an internal planning tool to help us gear up for the year ahead, but it's also a call to action to the wider world to recognize the needs that must be addressed.
Yeah, we're going to talk in more detail as the interview goes on about some of the specific countries in the top 5 in the rankings. But just going to that overall figure that you just articulated there, 305 million people in humanitarian need. I mean, that's up 4-fold on a decade. It was about 78 million in 2015. I mean, it really looks, doesn't it, like you're fighting a losing battle. We're all fighting a losing battle here.
Well, that's a very good point. Certainly the fact that there are now 59 conflicts going on around the world, that there are 42 non-state actors who are in control, de facto authorities. These are part of the syndrome that's seen this remarkable rise in humanitarian need. Now, it's also the case that this isn't just conflict that's driving humanitarian need, although that is the primary driver. There's also the climate crisis, which is exposing the most vulnerable parts of the world to extra danger. And in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been the consequences of higher interest rates and the economic drag anchor of a tougher economic climate. But these are all man-made. These aren't acts of fate. And the purpose of our watch list is to say that just as these have been created by human decisions, so the suffering of the civilians can be mitigated. I think it's important for your viewers to have in mind that more than 8 out of 10, 82% of the total number of people in humanitarian need are concentrated in just these 20 countries. Overall around the world, and you've seen this in the Middle East region, poverty levels are actually going down in stable states, but they're rising in conflict-affected, fragile states. Over the last 20 years, since the early 2000s, extreme poverty in stable countries has gone down by 30 to 40%. But in unstable, war-torn countries, it's gone up, and Syria would be a very good example. It's gone up. Sudan is obviously the prime example. It's gone up by nearly 90%.
I wanted to ask you about Syria. Of course, it's often called, well, it had been called one of the world's forgotten crises, and that's indeed a term that was used by the IRC to describe the situation there. It's been on your watch list for several years, and I'm just wondering now, with developments these last 2 weeks, with the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, what do you think that's going to mean for this crisis?
Well, that's a very good point that you make, that we never took Syria off our watch list. We said it had been forgotten by others, but not forgotten by us. We had teams working in the northwest of Syria and in the northeast of Syria, in the rebel-held areas. And across Syria as a whole, 16 million people out of a remaining population of maybe 17, 18 million, almost the whole, very large swathe of the population were in humanitarian need. Of course, the total population of Syria at the beginning of the civil war was about 25 million, but 6 million refugees have left the country to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, also Germany. UK has taken some. And so Syria was, as far as we're concerned, those who said the war was over, that President Assad had won, that felt to us like something that was detached from reality. Now, the situation today is that Syria well merits its place on our watch list with the 16 million people in humanitarian need. But if things go right, it shouldn't be on the watch list in a year's time. The trouble is we don't know. Obviously, there's a lot up for grabs. The new governing authorities are beginning to turn words into action. There's been some words about how Syria must be for all Syrians. Of course, Syria has a complex, diverse denominational population demographics. And the words have been about an inclusive government, an inclusive political settlement. That's obviously significant. Some refugees are coming back to Syria. The UN High Commission on Refugees says that up to 1 million will return in the first 6 months. But we also know that some minority groups are leaving. So it well merits its place on our watch list, but there is hope that in a year's time it won't be there.
And obviously, as we've been saying, a very fast evolving situation there, and really difficult to sort of make sense at this very early stage of what things are going to look like in a year from now. But in terms of the priorities for the IRC, what are you identifying as being the immediate things that need to be considered for helping the situation there?
You're talking about Syria, are you?
Syria, absolutely.
Yeah. And the most important priorities are, one, to make sure that there is an inclusive governing system. We worked in the northwest of Syria, where the armed opposition groups who are now in control of the whole country were in control before, and they let us get on with our business. We worked with the civil authorities to deliver humanitarian aid. We weren't told who to give aid to. We weren't told who to not to give aid to. Our funds were not interfered with. So that's very important. Secondly, it's vital that the health system of Syria, which in some ways has been significantly reduced, is sustained. Thirdly, there's a threat of hyperinflation, that the economic sustenance of the country is very, very important indeed. Obviously, that in part depends on engagement with the wider world. And obviously, from a humanitarian point of view, we want the border crossing points that were closed to humanitarian aid by President Assad to be opened up. So there are some immediate priorities that are really pressing.
And of course, there are some 7 million Syrian refugees living outside Syria, and some European countries are talking about suspending decisions on asylum claims by Syrian nationals. How concerned are you about what happens to them?
Well, obviously, Turkey has got 3 million refugees. They've talked very clearly about them going back. Lebanon, 1 million. Jordan, 500,000 to 1 million. And it's in everyone's interest that people are able to go back. Our stress is always that the returns need to be voluntary and they need to be safe. So European countries are saying, look, we don't know, we can't do an asylum adjudication at this point because it's impossible to say whether or not it's going to be safe for people to go back. We know that 2 weeks ago, people didn't feel safe to go back. They thought their sons and husbands would be brought into the army or worse. Now there's uncertainty. So you can understand that for a short period, there is stasis, there is an inability to make an asylum determination. But I think that the clear aim should be that Syria is safe enough for Syrians to go back.
Yeah, Gaza is also very high up the list of concerns for the IRC. And I'm just wondering how difficult it's been, given what's been happening there, to ensure that aid gets to those who need it the most.
Well, the situation in Gaza has been very, very difficult indeed. Gaza and the West Bank come out at number 2 on our watch list. Sudan, number 1, as I said earlier. Gaza is an extremely concentrated humanitarian catastrophe, to quote the UN Secretary General, and it affects 2 million people, 2 million Palestinians, as well as the 100 hostages who are still left in captivity. Though the needs of those people are absolutely enormous. We've been working on emergency medical work. We've been doing food and nutrition, water and sanitation. We've been trying to look after kids. But as the war goes on, the needs have just been absolutely astronomical. And of course, the health system has been all but destroyed in the course of the fighting. We've been clear that while we will ask our teams to carry on doing their work, these are local people who are hired within Gaza to do their work, the only sustainable way to protect civilians, to deliver aid, to protect aid workers, to release the hostages is to have a ceasefire. That's a political decision, not a humanitarian one, but we can make a humanitarian recommendation. And we've been arguing for a ceasefire for a very long time now as the only way to fulfill the humanitarian imperative. There have been some stories over the weekend that both sides, Hamas and Israel, are inching closer to an agreement to stop the fighting. Obviously, the sooner that happens, the better.
Indeed, and we've been getting reports of progress on that front. So, of course, we'll keep a close eye on developments. I wanted to ask you about Sudan. You mentioned it right at the beginning. Sudan, the biggest crisis now, and I understand, the biggest humanitarian crisis in history. And I'm just wondering, why do we hear so little about it, and what can be done to change that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think we hear so little about Sudan because there's so much else going on. Some of what else is going on is significant, whether it be in respect of Syria or whether it be in respect of the global economy. Some of what else is going on is, frankly, superficial and gets probably too much time. But I think Sudan has been squeezed. The Sudan catastrophe has been squeezed. I mean, in 2003-04, when there were massacres in Darfur, it was a major global story. In late 1980s, the Sudan crisis was a major global story. The people of Sudan deserve to have their attention of the world on their situation, because 10% of the total number of people in humanitarian need in the world are in Sudan. A small number, maybe 1 million refugees, small by comparison to 30 million. 1 million refugees have gone into Chad. About 500,000, 600,000 have gone to South Sudan. Those are both poor countries. And so the strain and the stress on the people of Sudan is absolutely huge, as well as on the neighboring states. And our call has been not just on the parties to the conflict, the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Force, to allow humanitarian aid to flow, which both of them have been blocking it, but also on the states that are supporting each side to stop. Because at the moment, both sides think they can win. They seem to have an endless supply of arms. And that is creating now an 18-month humanitarian disaster that threatens to become much longer. And Sudan has been top of our watch list twice. It's the largest humanitarian catastrophe in world history, as you point out. And there's very little hope at the moment that it's going to get better.
I mean, when we look at a report like the one that the IRC has just published, I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of very bleak and very depressing news contained in there. And of course, it's extremely important information. But when you're trying to get donors on board, maintain morale within the organisation, it's important, I'd imagine, as well, to have some uplifting findings, some uplifting stories. Has there been anything in the last year that stood out for you as being something that perhaps has given morale a little bit of a boost and said to you, this is all worth it?
Yes, there are many things, but as you've read the report, so you know that as well as the litany of suffering, we're very clear at the end of the report. We have 6 clear sets of recommendations about how aid can be better delivered, and the aid system can be reformed, how civilians can get access to aid, how civilian suffering can be eased by investing in anticipatory action because of climate crisis, how the economy needs to better support the most vulnerable people in the world in fragile and conflict states. So there's a clear agenda for action in our report, not just an agenda for disaster planning. And we are always clear that as a solutions-oriented NGO, our recommendations for what to do come from our clear evidence of what works. So over the last year, we've seen compelling evidence of our immunization drive in East Africa, of our water and sanitation work in Gaza, of our early child development work in the Middle East as well, of our anticipatory action for climate disaster in northern Nigeria. There is no excuse that we don't know what to do. We actually do know what to do. The question is whether or not it can get the funding to support it. And this is not just funding from Western countries. It remains the case that more than 80% of the world's humanitarian funding comes from Western countries. But Western countries don't represent more than 80% of humanitarian need in the world. We all need to share this burden much more fairly. Your own region, the Middle East, is now very wealthy in some ways. And those with power and responsibility and wealth, I hope, will in 2025 take a New Year's resolution to direct their wealth and power to some of the world's most vulnerable people.
Yeah, and of course we're going to have a fairly significant change in Washington in a month or so from now. I'm just wondering whether you're optimistic and what your outlook is for the year ahead with a change of administration at the helm of the most powerful country in the world.
Well, I'm an optimistic person, so I have a optimistic mindset. Obviously, we wait to see what President Trump does, because it's very important that while politics is about tweets and arguments and debates, I used to be in politics, when it comes to people's lives in the humanitarian field, we have to be more cautious. We don't respond in a knee-jerk fashion to what's said. I think that it's very important to recognize that the global engagement of countries like the United States can be for good or can be for ill. And it's very important that we make the case for how it can be for good. President Trump has obviously made some very clear statements about how he wants to focus on the home front. But as you say, the decisions in the US have global resonance, they have global implications. And there are requirements of global leadership that I think are very important.
OK, well, we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, though. David Miliband, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, President-elect Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that ending the war in Ukraine is his top priority. He wants to do so quickly, within 24 hours of taking office, to be precise. We're already seeing elements of that plan becoming a reality, with Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, planning a trip to Kyiv in January. That's according to 2 anonymous sources, and it's apparently going to happen shortly after New Year's Day. Well, Kellogg will travel to several other capitals, including Paris and Rome, but not to Moscow. Well, during his meetings, he is expected to focus on fact-finding rather than active negotiations. Well, in the past, Donald Trump and his allies have advocated multiple plans to wind down the Ukraine war, most of which would involve Ukraine ceding large areas of its territory to Russia. Well, for more, we can speak now to Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under President Barack Obama. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We've been promised this swift end to the war in Ukraine. How likely is that to happen?
Well, it won't be 24 hours, that's for sure. But it is interesting how fast the Trump team is moving out. There's still a U.S. president. It's Joe Biden, but you would think that Trump's team has already taken power, given the numbers of meetings that they've had. Even a couple of weeks ago, Macron and Zelensky met with Trump. There was a Ukraine team also that traveled to Washington and met with Kellogg and with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. So this has been going on, and the good news is that this is some fact-finding. Facts are a good thing, and I'm glad this administration is focused on that.
OK, so some fact-finding rather than any specific goal. Just tell us a bit more about retired General Keith Kellogg. He's 80 years old. Just wondering what you think he brings to the table.
Well, you're right about his age. I think that certainly gives us all pause. To embark on a negotiating trip, even a fact-finding trip, but if it becomes negotiations later on, it takes a lot of stamina. So we'll have to see what kind of role he plays there. But I think what Keith Kellogg brings is some understanding on how things actually work in terms of negotiations with other nations. And he probably has an understanding of Europe as well. If he was in the army and he's 80 years old and he's had some Cold War time, probably based in Germany or something along those lines. So he has a feel for processes and structure. Now, that doesn't mean Trump likes process and structure. He doesn't even know what it is, but he knows that he doesn't like it. So Kellogg has a tough time trying to marry up what he knows works when you talk to other nations, when you try to negotiate something as tricky as Ukraine, security guarantees, that type of thing. So he's got to translate that into something that Trump will accept and will understand. And that's tough. But he's bringing this background that enables him to certainly grasp the nuance of how difficult these negotiations will be.
Yeah, one of the things he said that sound pretty striking was the fact that he is prepared to go to Moscow to have meetings there if invited. I mean, were General Kellogg to go to Moscow, that would be a pretty extraordinary step, wouldn't it, for a US official, given that sanctions are in place and given the state of relations between Moscow and Washington.
And also given the fact that the Trump administration isn't in power yet. So Keith Kellogg could certainly, I guess he could get some type of waivers to go to Moscow. He could meet with Putin's people there. But I think I think that's an extreme step. I think that's a foolish step until he does gather the facts. And I think what's really important in all of this, though, is that he's going to go to European capitals. I was concerned that he and the Trump administration would try to do something on their own with Putin, that it would be negotiated over the heads of the European nations, and they wouldn't be involved. So the fact that Kellogg is going to these European capitals to see what Europe thinks, at least the leading capitals. What does Macron think? What does Meloni think? And I hope he goes to Poland. I hope he goes to the UK, to the Nordics. There's other stops he could make, and I understand they're still putting together his itinerary. But the good news here is, number one, they are going for facts, and number two, it looks like they're asking European allies what their views are as well.
Yeah, and unless he goes to Budapest, he's likely to get a pretty unanimous set of opinions, isn't he, with regards to the support that Europe and the United States, it's felt, owes to Ukraine.
Well, that's an interesting question. He might go to Budapest just because of tipping the hat of the Trump administration's favor that they show to Budapest. So he might drop by there, and I guess he probably does need to hear from them. They've got a voice at NATO, certainly, and a vote at NATO. So, but I think your point about unity in Europe, about Ukraine, it's hard to say that there's a unified view. As you know, if you talk to Poles or Balts, Nordics, they're pretty hard over about Ukraine and no deal, and we got to win there. As you go further south, Italy, in Rome, he might hear something different in Rome than he might hear in Warsaw, for instance. So I think this fact-finding probably will involve seeing what kind of unity there is there in Europe now. I mean, he'll probably need at some point to talk to the European Union. They are major players now in terms of finance, in terms of mobilizing a European defense industry. So he needs to stop in Brussels. But that might come later, at least in this initial visit. He's going to some European capitals to test the waters, and we'll see what he comes back with.
How much of a departure do you think we can expect from the Biden administration's approach to this war?
Well, that's interesting. I think certainly the initial impressions, based on what's been said, is it'll be quite a departure in that, the Biden administration continued to send large amounts of assistance to Ukraine. They weren't pressuring, at least publicly, they weren't pressuring Kyiv to make a deal. They weren't talking to Moscow or any Russian leaders at all. There's a whole different view about, and it was a long-term view about supporting Ukraine. With Trump, they said no more assistance, or we'll give assistance only if we have to do that to drive Russia to the table. I mean, there's been a lot of ideas floated by various, I can't even call them officials, but various people in the Trump camp that talk about how assistance might be used as leverage. But we do know that the Republicans, there's a part of the Republican Party that wants to keep assistance going, but there's another part that does not. And so where the Trump team falls in that is probably split, and we'll have to just see in the weeks and months to come.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, we've heard most recently from Donald Trump on the issue of Ukraine, him saying, gotta make a deal. That's with reference to discussions he intends to hold with both President Zelensky and Putin. I mean, do you think the deal is inevitably going to involve Ukraine giving up large sections of its territory?
Well, it is difficult to say. I will give you my own personal impression is probably so. I don't know if it'll be large amounts of land. I don't know what kind of security guarantees will come with that, because I can't see Ukraine saying we'll give up the Donbas region and be left high and dry without NATO membership or any kind of security guarantees from the West. So it's all going to be part of these negotiations, but I think certainly on the table will be the land already occupied by Russia. Kursk might be on the table too in some ways. Ukrainian forces are still in Kursk, so it's going to be a difficult discussion. And Russia has a strong hand, unfortunately, in this. And Zelensky's hand that he's been dealt has been weakened by Trump saying, we're going to cut a deal, 24 hours, no assistance. So he's got his back to the wall, unfortunately.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Jim Townsend, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. Saudi Arabia is in the sporting spotlight for the second time in a week as boxing joins football in global coverage of the kingdom. First, FIFA confirmed that Saudi Arabia will be hosting the 2034 World Cup. Then two faces familiar to the residents of Riyadh step back into the ring for a rematch for the ages. Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury. Well, I had a chance to sit down with Tyson Fury for a rematch of our own first interview. Tyson, nice to get round two with you a few months on. Looking back on the fight from last time, did you underestimate Alexander Usyk, do you think?
No, I didn't. No, he got a decision over me. He won by 1 point. Very close fight. Good luck to the guy. And we're going to run it back on Saturday. And it's going to be victory for me.
Fingers crossed. But the thing is, you now know each other's tactics pretty well.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that perhaps the fight will go in a similar way, similar style?
It might do, yeah. Well, it'll all play out on Saturday night how it plays out, really.
Now, I know both you and Alexander Usyk are Manchester United fans.
Are we?
So you might, well, apparently, yeah. So
I didn't know he was.
You must be both happy about the victory against the arch rivals Man City.
Yes, good little victory. Yeah. City are on a big losing streak at the moment.
But it also came at a time when Saudi got announced with the FIFA 2034 Cup.
Yes.
Now, knowing the country as you do, with the sports here, what do you expect from a Saudi World Cup?
I think it's going to be a fantastic World Cup. First of all, congratulations to Saudi on getting the FIFA World Cup 32. I think it'll be a fantastic event. Any sporting event that's held in Saudi is usually a marvellous event. So I'm sure the biggest sporting event on earth, the FIFA World Cup, will be even bigger.
Now, it's true because when you look at boxing along with football, UFC, tennis, Formula One, and Live Golf, for example, it's transforming the Saudi scene. And what's it like for you to have played quite a major role in that kind of transformation?
It's been fantastic. It's been a fantastic opportunity for me to come here and showcase over in Saudi Arabia and also get the biggest fights that's possible on earth.
Well, so many of the great popular dramas of our time, from The Godfather to The Matrix to The Lord of the Rings, have been trilogies. Even your own famous trilogy versus Daytona Wilder. Now, His Excellency Turki al-Sheikh recently said he wants you to do the job in the rematch to pave the way for the Fury Usyk trilogy next year. What do you think? Will that trilogy happen?
I think it's going to happen, yes. I think it'll happen. When I win on Saturday night, I think there's got to be a trilogy next year for sure.
Now, there are fans, millions of fans who'd love to see you, still eager to see you fight Anthony Joshua. You famously said Joshua was losing to Dubois, cost you £150 million in lost revenue for your super fight against him. What would the trilogy take precedence over a Fury versus Joshua?
For sure. Joshua's in tatters at the moment. He's got to pick up the pieces from his last fight. But the fight with Usyk, again, the one on Saturday and then one afterwards will be fantastic for me.
Now, Mike Tyson has thrown his support behind you in your fight with Usyk. And we just saw him step into the ring and lose to the YouTube megastar Jake Paul last month. What did you make of that bout? And just out of curiosity, would we ever expect to see you fight Jake Paul when you're 58 maybe?
No, definitely not. Not for me at 58. Mike's an awesome guy, and to get back in the ring at 58 takes a lot of guts. He needs to be respected for that. And, it was big for boxing, one of the biggest fights that boxing's ever seen with Jake and Mike. And I thought it was fantastic. Obviously Mike didn't get the result, but it was good for Mike, good for Mike's pocket, and good for Jake's pocket too. So fantastic for boxing.
When I asked you last time, though, would you step into the ring at around 60? You said, if the price is right.
Always. I'm a prize fighter.
Okay. Now, it's coming. This bout's coming around near the Christmas time, the Christmas season for a lot of people in the Western world, especially. And I wonder what the Fury household is like around this time of the year.
Mayhem. There's a lot of sweets and chocolates and cooking going on. A lot of action.
Last time we spoke, we had the chance to do this 12 quick fire questions, where I asked you about competitions, who would win against who. This time, let's do an interesting one if we can. Okay. We do like 10 rounds of names, which, when I say the name, if you can, give me a one-word description for that name.
Yep.
You want to try that? So, Alexander Usyk.
The cat.
Okay.
Rabbit.
3 words.
Just one then, rabbit.
Anthony Joshua.
Sausage.
All right. Eddie Hearn.
Fast.
Okay. I won't ask you to explain these just yet, but anyway, Turki al-Sheikh.
Excellent.
Okay. Donald Trump.
President.
Elon Musk.
Genius.
Muhammad Ali.
The greatest. Well, that's 2.
Mike Tyson.
Legend.
Okay, and then your dad, John Fury.
Papa.
Be careful with this last one. Your wife, Paris.
A witch.
We'll have to cut that one, I think.
That'd be all right.
Tyson Fury, thank you so
very
much. Really, what a pleasure.
All the best. Thanks
Always.
again.
Thank you, sir.
All the best.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Seoul. We give you a tour to the soul of South Korea's Seoul City. It's the destination that offers tourists endless shopping and dining experiences, a dose of fun and entertainment, its ages-old traditions, history, and unique culture. For the first-timer, get a quick introduction through the city via the Seoul City Bus Tour. It's the top recommended way to see Seoul on your first day. It will speed through Seoul's top city highlights, which you can view during the day or in the evening. It's time to visit the arts and festival scene of South Korea. Of course, Korea is popular for its history and tradition, but Seoul has just a lot of modern, international, and contemporary events to offer. There's always a regular listing of festivals and performances in the city, as well as exhibits on display at the art museums. Done sightseeing? Time for shopping. Seoul is in fact known for all the shopping, cultural events aside. The Koreans actually refer to window shopping as eye shopping. The top places to visit are Insadong, Apgujeong, Myeongdong, Dongdaemun, and Itaewon. Fan of Korean dramas and K-pop? Well, Seoul is definitely the place for that. Seoul is the popular capital of Hallyu, or the Korean wave in pop culture. And the city is teeming with items to adorn your K-pop fandom with. Then there are the Korean traditional markets. BB creams and bibimbap aside, this is the place to experience the traditional Korea. This is where you can buy traditional products such as the hanbok, ginseng, or electronics. Practically everything is sold there. There are also food stalls that offer Korean food, such as blood sausage, bindae-tteok, or deep-fried Korean pancakes, kimbap, maekyeoli, among others. Also a must-visit is the Namsan Seoul Tower. It's an iconic landmark that offers the best spot to see the entire Seoul. It has a warm, luminescent glow at night. The tower also has a revolving restaurant, which is a popular place to dine for touring couples. Namsan Seoul Tower is also where couples will find the famous locks of love and can leave their own too.
Irene, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you to sort of walk me through how you view your role within NATO, because women today are under pressure in various parts of the world and, frankly, in the West.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to have this moment of exchange about a very important topic, not only women in NATO, but I would say on women across the globe and about our rights and the general pushback, I would say, that we are facing today. The role I have at NATO, I'm the NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, is not new. I'm the fourth Special Representative. The position was established in 2012. But after 12 years, I have to say that despite the progress that we have made within the alliance, there is still much to do. Of course, the work I do within NATO is around the mandate of the alliance. So it's specific about the role of women and peace and security. So we do not cover other issues. But of course, what we do contributes to advancing gender equality. And it is also stated in our latest strategic concept endorsed in Madrid in 2022 that advancing gender equality is a reflection of the common values of the alliance. So what I do is really to look at everything that the alliance does to make sure that gender perspectives are included. What does this mean? It means that every time we take a decision, both at political and a military level, we have to make sure that we consider the diversity of the population. Population is made by half by men and the other half by women, so we cannot take decision without considering that security is perceived in a different way by men and women.
No doubt. How concerned are you when you see President-elect Trump's pick for defense saying that women shouldn't be in combat roles?
This is a topic that has been discussed over the decades around the globe. The hope was that we had overcome the barriers, the cultural barriers. Certainly, we have overcome the legal barriers. So everywhere in our across allies and also in our partners countries, women are part of the armed forces. In different extents, I would say across NATO allies, we have an average of 12%. So if we look at the population, as I said, 50% made by women, there is still a big gap to cover this percentage. I think that we still have a lot of work to overcome cultural barriers and change the mindset. We are not all at the same stage. So this conversation will certainly be put at the table, but there is a general consensus that women have to be part of the military forces. And we have proof that nowadays, if we look at Ukraine, how incredible women are fighting now on the front line. Since the full-scale invasion, a lot of women have joined voluntarily, and that's very important to say, that they were not obliged to do it. They are around 60,000 now in the armed forces. More than 40,000 are civilians, but the rest are military, and 5,000 are fighting on the front line alongside with their male colleagues.
If the United States rolls back women's role in the military, and I mean in combat positions, does that weaken the NATO alliance and the NATO mission?
I'm not expecting this change to happen. Of course, I'm expecting maybe some conversation around this, but there is a consensus. There are policies in place. This year in Washington, D.C., and our big yearly summit, we endorse a new women, peace and security policy. When we endorse a policy, 32 allies come together and they agree on what is on the policy.
Including the United States.
Including.
Yeah.
Indeed. And this lasts for 5 years. And the policy states very clearly that increasing participation of women in all peace and security efforts, both on the diplomatic and in the military side, is what we have to do if we want to enhance our operational effectiveness. Yeah. And this is where my work leads, to the implementation of this policy that will be translated next year in a new action plan. We are working on it. And this is where I will concentrate my efforts.
Yeah. Talk to me about this. You mentioned Ukraine and the role of women there in combat positions that they've taken on as an act of necessity. There's a lot of conversation, of course, about how that war may come to a conclusion. In your mind, are women better prepared to take on roles not just in the military now, but also in government in Ukraine?
I think as historically we have seen how wars change the role of women within the society. They open up different possibilities because men go to the front line. In this case, the front line is both physical and also in the space, because we see the war in Ukraine played on the hybrid space and cybersecurity, but also with very old technique on the front line. Women have filled the position in Ukraine as they did in the past during the First World War and Second World War. We see incredible women in politics at governmental level. We see women on the front line and covering all roles in the society. Even in the defense industry recently, women have stepped up and take more positions. So I think this has worked as an accelerator for the society, and I expect that women will continue to play an important role in the resolution of the conflict and in the post-conflict, where we hope a just peace will happen soon, and we will see women to continue to take their important position.
When are we going to see a NATO Secretary General who is a woman? Because I know that was something that was mooted at the time, at the last round of conversations about this.
There was a lot of conversation about this. We need to find the best candidates. I will always say there are some requirements, and requirements are that the Secretary General has to be a former Prime Minister or President. And this is where the conversation has to be broader.
Yes.
Because the point is, why don't we have more women in politics covering this position? Because automatically then we could have more candidates for the position of the Secretary General. So now we have just welcomed our new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, but as you might hear, this week he announced a Deputy Secretary General, who is a woman and from North Macedonia, and she will join us in supposedly a few weeks. And she's the second one in the history, so it's already a progress. And I think maybe next one could be.
Could it be Giorgia Meloni?
You're right in my mind, because the conversation we had, it's also about the South and the rotation. You know, in alliance,
Exactly.
we're trying to rotate, and sometimes, I mean, we see a tendency to have a Secretary General coming from the northern countries, and there was a conversation about the South, but the requirements didn't come together. So one option could be to change the requirements, and the other is to see more prime minister in the South. So, of course, Giorgia Meloni could be a candidate in the future.
Walk me through this. Today, the rest of this region continues to reel over what we've seen happen in Afghanistan, and I'm talking about the subjugation of women and girls. Obviously, that was an area of serious concern for NATO, and when coalition forces were there. In your mind, what is the responsibility of NATO today to those women that we promised a future and then abandoned?
That's a difficult conversation to take. You know that NATO operates under mandates, and when we operate out of our area of responsibility, we do based on resolution of the United Nations Security Council. We withdraw, the mission is over. So as an alliance, we do no longer have a responsibility there collectively because we are no longer present. But of course, allies, individually and bilaterally and in different contexts such as...
And as human beings.
Yes, and they continue to provide support. The situation is very worrisome. There are no words to describe what happened. And I think that individually, as I said, a human being and with our respective roles at national level, we have to continue to speak out about what is happening there and to fight for women's rights, because the silence will really put them, you know, in a we will forgive about them, even if we don't do. But in the global conversation, you see, if you read the newspaper, it doesn't really come on the news so often.
What do you think is the solution there in your mind? Because obviously there is an ability of nations who are giving aid to Afghanistan to exert pressure on them.
If I could have a solution, you know, I would try to put this, implement it. I found that extremely difficult. What I'm doing on my side is to continue dialogue with women from Afghan and see if there is a way to support. One of the focus is always how to train women to create space for dialogue for them in terms of dialogue also with the Taliban or mediation processes. And I know that there are several women who are also present in Doha a few years ago that continue the dialogue and try also to train younger generation to make sure that they will have the possibility to play a role and to exercise their right.
When you come to a forum like this one, based in the United Emirates, a country that has promoted women not just to positions in government, but also mandated their participation on boards in the private sector, are you encouraged by what you see and how the region is evolving?
Indeed, I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to engage in person, because I think this is the best way when then you have a concrete example that you can share. When people ask me, what do you do? It's difficult to explain then if you don't have stories to tell. And changing the narrative is what we absolutely have to do. So it's a very positive example, and I'm really looking forward to attending the forum tomorrow.
Tell me this, what is missing in your mind from the global dialogue for women? Because when we speak about this from a business perspective, we talk about quotas and we talk about a number of women on boards. One woman feels alone, 2 women has a friend, and then 3 women can make a change. But in your mind, from a governance perspective, from a security perspective, what needs to change?
I think it's a question of the cultural change I was mentioning earlier. And it's about gender, what we call gender-responsive leadership. We focus a lot on the participation of women, but we still find resistance, cultural barriers. And sometimes women are there because government decide to do, and then speak at global level, not referring to the local situation. But at the end, there is no real willingness to integrate. So it's more a token than a reality. So I think that what we have to look is the change of mindset of who is in power today, which in the normality are men. So we have to look into what we call the gender-responsive leadership to say that to train, to dialogue with both men and women together to understand the benefit that the entire society will have if women take on more position at high level. It's not for women, it's not helping women to do something, when they say, I'm helping my wife. No, it's not about this. Because in the moment where the dynamic changes, men will benefit from this different dynamic. They will have more time for the children. They have more time even for discussion and conversation, not under the pressure. And the solution that will be found will be better solution because they will really bring the perspective of the entire society. So this topic of the gender-responsive leadership is something I advocated for and I put as a first goal of the new policy at NATO because I think that in a male-dominated environment, while we work to increase the number of women, we have also to work with the men who are present to make sure that we can reach the same high-quality solution in a shorter time.
Bring them with us.
Yes.
Irene, it's great to have you here at Al Arabiya. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes